Cordelia Varn's laugh cut through the mercantile like a blade. It wasn't the kind of laugh that invited others to join in, it was the kind designed to draw blood. Sharp, deliberate, aimed. Well, look at that. Cordelia pressed one gloved finger toward the little girl standing frozen beside the bolt of blue-flowered calico. A feed sack princess, the women around her giggled on cue. The child, 9 years old, wearing a brown dress so patched it barely remembered its original shape, didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with her small hand inches from fabric she had never touched, color rising in her cheeks like something being slowly set on fire. Her mother, Lenora Whitfield, went very still at the counter behind her, and the entire mercantile held its breath, because everyone in Alder Creek knew that when a woman like Cordelia Varn started laughing at someone, it was wise to look away and let it happen. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single episode, because the story of Lenora Whitfield and what happened in that mercantile is just getting started. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us the city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Alder Creek. The morning had started the way most of Lenora Whitfield's mornings started, with a careful count. She sat at the kitchen table before dawn, with the lamp turned low, adding the same numbers she'd added the night before, and the night before that, as if hoping they might change if she looked at them long enough. They never did. The flour was nearly gone. The lamp oil was down to a quarter bottle. The coins in the cracked blue teacup on the shelf, the one that had belonged to her mother, the one she never used for actual tea, amounted to 63 cents. She listened to Elsie breathing in the next room. Slow, steady, still asleep. Lenora put the coins in her apron pocket, blew out the lamp, and started water on the stove. She didn't waste time feeling sorry for herself. That was something she'd made a decision about 18 months ago, standing in this same kitchen the morning after they'd buried Thomas, with the lawyer's letter still on the table, telling her that the farm carried more debt than she'd known and that the bank wanted to discuss terms. She'd stood at this stove, and she'd thought, very clearly, you can fall apart later. Right now, put the water on. She still hadn't gotten around to falling apart. Elsie appeared in the doorway at 7, her dark hair tangled from sleep, one stocking half on. Are we going to town? We need flour, Lenora said. And oil. Can I come? Get your other stocking on. Elsie disappeared. Lenora listened to the sounds of the child getting dressed, the small crash of something knocked off a shelf, the muttered apology to no one in particular, the sound of small feet on wooden floors, and felt something complicated move through her chest. Not quite grief, not quite pride. Something in between the two that she didn't have a name for. She braided Elsie's hair at the table, and they walked the 1.5 miles into Alder Creek together. The town was awake and loud by the time they arrived. Wagons lined the main street. A group of ranch hands were loading supplies outside the feed store. 2 women in good dresses stood talking outside the post office, and one of them glanced at Lenora and Elsie, and then looked away with the particular speed of someone pretending they hadn't looked at all. Lenora kept walking. Hartley's Mercantile occupied the corner of Alder Creek's main street, and what passed for a side street, which was really just a rutted lane leading down to the livery. It was the town's only real general store, which gave Emmett Hartley certain powers he was generally careful not to abuse, and which made the people who shopped there careful not to give him reason to. Lenora pushed open the door and guided Elsie inside. The store smelled like dried beans and tobacco and the particular sharp scent of new canvas. It was busy for a weekday morning. 3 women stood near the fabric display, at the far end Cordelia Varn in a cream-colored dress with yellow trim, and 2 others whose names Lenora knew but preferred not to use Mrs. Aldridge and Mrs. Pierce, both of whom had stopped greeting Lenora on the street sometime around the 3rd month after Thomas died, for reasons that had never been stated, but that Lenora understood perfectly well. A widow with debts and no prospects was a particular kind of invisible. Lenora moved toward the counter. Emmett Hartley was helping another customer, and she waited, keeping Elsie close beside her with a hand on the girl's shoulder. That was when Elsie drifted. It wasn't intentional. It was the way children drift when something beautiful catches their eye. She moved without thinking, 3 steps and then 4, until she was standing at the edge of the fabric display, looking at a bolt of blue-flowered calico that caught the morning light coming through the front window and turned it into something that seemed to glow. Lenora saw her daughter's hand rise, the small reaching gesture, the fingers just barely not touching, and saw, in the same moment, Cordelia Varn notice. The laugh came before anything else. It arrived first, before the words, announcing them. Well, look at that. Cordelia's voice had the carrying quality of someone who had never needed to lower it. A feedsack princess. The two women with her made sounds. Not quite laughs. More like agreement in the form of breath. Elsie's hand dropped. She turned, and for a terrible moment, Lenora watched her daughter's face go through a series of expressions that no 9-year-old should have to manage in a public place. Confusion, understanding, and then a shame so sudden and so complete that it looked physical, like something had struck her. The mercantile went quiet in the particular way that places go quiet when something cruel is happening, and everyone is deciding whether to witness it. Lenora was moving before the decision to move had fully formed in her mind. She crossed the store in 6 steps and placed herself between Cordelia Varn and her daughter. Not aggressive, not shaking, very still the way water goes still just before it does something. Mrs. Varn. Her voice came out even, which surprised her slightly. My daughter has nothing to be ashamed of. Cordelia blinked. People didn't generally speak directly to her in that tone. I heard what you were only doing. Lenora kept her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry, which she knew was a strange instinct for a moment like this. But she had Elsie pressed against her side, and she didn't want this to get bigger. And I'm asking you, in front of your friends, not to do it again. Cordelia's expression shifted from amusement to something cooler. My goodness. I didn't realize a simple observation would cause such. It wasn't an observation, Lenora said, and you know that. The silence stretched. Mrs. Aldridge was staring at a bolt of brown wool with tremendous concentration. Mrs. Pierce had found something interesting to examine near the door. Even Emmett Hartley, behind his counter, was busy with something below the register that apparently required his complete attention. Cordelia made a small sound dismissive, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd already written, and turned back to the fabric. Lenora took Elsie's hand and walked to the counter. She bought the flour. She bought the lamp oil. She counted the coins out with her thumb against the copper and placed them on the counter without looking at Cordelia Varn again. Emmett Hartley took the money and bagged the goods and said, "Have a good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," in a voice that was carefully neutral in a way that told her nothing. She guided Elsie outside. They were 20 steps from the mercantile door when Elsie said quietly, "Mama, my dress is ugly." Lenora stopped walking. She turned and crouched down on the boardwalk, right there in front of anyone who wanted to see, and took Elsie's face in both hands. The child's eyes were dry, which was almost worse than tears. She'd learned already not to cry in public. 9 years old, and she'd already learned that. "Listen to me," Lenora said. "Your dress is clean. Your dress is mended. That's not ugly. You know what's ugly? Using a little girl to feel bigger than you are. That's ugly. And that's hers, Elsie, not yours, you hear me?" Elsie looked at her for a long moment, but she had a pretty dress. She did. And someday you'll have a pretty dress too. And when you do, you're going to remember today. And you're never going to do to another little girl what she just did to you. Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, Mama." They walked home, carrying the flour and the lamp oil. Lenora did not look back. Inside the mercantile, she didn't see what happened next. She couldn't have known. Callum Redford had been standing beside the cast iron stove near the back of the store since before Lenora and Elsie arrived. He was there because he'd come in to ask Emmett Hartley about a freight order that was running 2 weeks late, and Emmett had asked him to wait while he sorted through a pile of invoices that had apparently gotten mixed up with someone else's shipment, and waiting was something Callum Redford was reasonably patient about. He was a large man, Callum. Not in a way that drew attention. Particularly, he was the kind of large that looked like simple work, like something that happened over years rather than something performed. He was 41 years old, with a face that had been outdoors for most of those years, and hands that showed it. He wore his good coat to town because his mother had told him that showing up to town in your work coat was a form of rudeness, and he'd never found a reason to disagree with her. He'd watched the whole thing from beside the stove. He'd watched Elsie drift toward the fabric. Watched Cordelia Varn's face shift from boredom to interest. Watched the laugh happen, and the little girl's face afterward, and Lenora crossing the floor and saying something he'd been too far away to fully hear, though he'd caught the tone of it, which was a specific kind of steadiness that he recognized as very controlled anger. He'd watched Lenora buy her flour and her lamp oil and take her daughter outside. And then he stood there for a moment beside the stove and looked at the bolt of blue-flowered calico and made a decision. Cordelia Varn reached for the fabric at the same moment. Emmett Hartley came back with the freight papers and said, "All right, Mr. Redford, here's what we've—" "Hold on a moment, Emmett." Callum walked toward the fabric display. He reached into his coat pocket, removed a fold of bills, and placed them on the counter beside the calico. "How much for the whole bolt?" Emmett Hartley looked at the money, then at Callum, then at Cordelia Varn, whose hand was still on the fabric. Emmett started. "The whole thing," Callum said. He said it the same way he said most things, without raising his voice, without performing anything. Just a statement of what he intended to happen. Cordelia's hand didn't move right away. She looked at Callum with an expression that had several things in it, most of them unflattering. "I was about to purchase some of that." Callum looked at her. "I know." A moment passed. Cordelia withdrew her hand. Emmett Hartley counted the money and cut the bolt from its rack, 30 yards of blue-flowered calico, and wrapped it in paper, and Callum picked it up under one arm and collected his freight papers with the other hand and walked out of the mercantile into the morning sun. He didn't look at Cordelia Varn again. He didn't explain himself. He just walked out carrying 30 yards of the fabric they'd used to make a little girl feel small. The problem, Callum realized almost immediately, was that he didn't have a plan. He'd acted on something instinct, maybe, or the particular discomfort of watching something mean happen in a place he was standing. And now he was outside with 30 yards of calico he had no use for and no clear idea of what to do with it. He stood beside his horse and looked at the package for a moment. He could just ride out to Whitfield Hollow and give it to the woman. That was the obvious thing. He'd seen Lenora Whitfield in town before, not often, but enough to know who she was. Widow. Seamstress. Daughter. Living out on Thomas Whitfield's old place, which, according to Emmett Hartley, who knew everyone's business without particularly meaning to, was mortgaged up close to its roof beams. The obvious thing was to just hand her the fabric. But something about that felt wrong. Not the giving of it that seemed straightforward enough. The way of it. He thought about the way she'd stood in the mercantile, the particular upright quality of it, the care she'd taken with her words. A woman who carried herself that way wasn't going to want to stand on the receiving end of someone's charity and thank him for it. She'd take the fabric and she'd thank him, and the whole rest of the interaction would be uncomfortable for both of them. He needed a different angle. He thought about it while he loaded his freight papers into his saddlebag. He thought about the cattle drive, which was coming up in less than 2 months, and which had been increasingly present in the back of his mind because it was the largest drive he'd planned in 4 years, and his usual camp cook had broken 2 fingers in an accident with a horse gate and couldn't manage the supply work. He thought about 30 cowboys who were going to need shirts sewn and blankets repaired, and winter gear organized before they moved a herd across the high country. He untied his horse, loaded the fabric, and turned toward the road that led to Whitfield Hollow. He had something that might work. Lenora was at the clothesline in the side yard when she heard hoofbeats. She finished pinning the last sheet before she turned around. There was a principle in that, somewhere, and watched a large man on a gray horse come down the lane toward the house. She didn't recognize him at first. Then she did, and wished briefly that she hadn't, because it made the moment more complicated. Callum Redford. The Redford Ranch sat about 8 miles east of Whitfield Hollow and occupied enough of the county that it was hard to be in Alder Creek without running into someone who worked there, or sold to it, or depended on it in some way. The man himself she'd spoken to twice in 3 years, once at the church social, the first autumn after Thomas died, when he'd said something polite about the pie she'd brought, and once at the feed store when they'd reached for the same door handle, and both stepped back. He dismounted and looped his reins over the fence post and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, sorry to come without notice, Mr. Redford." She kept her expression neutral. The package under his arm was wrapped in brown paper, and she did not look at it. "What can I do for you?" "I have a business proposition, if you have a few minutes." She looked at him. The thing about Callum Redford was that there was no performance to him, no sense of someone managing an impression. He just stood there in his good coat, looking like what he was, which was a man with something to say and enough patience to wait until he'd said it properly. "Come up on the porch," she said. He sat in the other chair and set the package on the porch rail between them and told her what he needed. 40 cowboys preparing for a major cattle drive. Shirts sewn, at least 20. Blankets repaired, maybe 30. Winter gear inventoried and organized. He named a figure that was nearly twice what she'd expected, and she kept her expression steady because she'd learned that showing surprise at numbers was a negotiating disadvantage. And the leftover material, he said, stays with you. Whatever's left from the job. She looked at the package on the rail. Is that calico? She said. It's part of the material, he said. How much of it? Some of it. A pause, 30 yards. She looked at him directly. He met her eyes without flinching, which told her he knew exactly what he'd done and why, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Mr. Redford, she said, I'm not interested in charity. It's not charity, he said. I need shirts. The material is for shirts. You bought 30 yards of blue-flowered calico for cowboy shirts. The smallest possible pause. Cowboys can wear what they're given. Something moved at the edge of Lenora's expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. She pressed her lips together and looked out at the yard. Elsie was visible through the window of the house, sitting at the kitchen table. Lenora could see her small head bent over something, probably the old reader she'd looked through so many times the cover had come off. 63 cents in the teacup. Flour for maybe 2 weeks. Lamp oil for less. The figure you named, Lenora said. I want it in writing with payment every 2 weeks. Done. And if you try to pay me less on account of being a widow or some similar notion, I'll return the work half finished and you can find someone else. I wouldn't do that. Most men say they wouldn't. I expect they do, Callum said. I'll have the agreement written and sent out by Thursday. She nodded. Then we have a deal. He stood to leave, and she watched him unhitch his horse from the fence post. And then she said, without fully planning to, Mr. Redford, he stopped. Thank you, she said. Not for the charity. For the principle of the thing. He looked at her for a moment. I just bought fabric, Mrs. Whitfield. Used it for its intended purpose. He rode out. Lenora sat on the porch for another minute before she went inside, and when she did, she found Elsie at the table with the reader and sat down across from her and said, Elsie, we're going to be all right. Elsie looked up. How do you know? Because I just got a job. What kind of job? The kind where someone pays us real wages. Elsie looked at her mother for a moment. Then she looked at the brown paper package that Lenora had carried inside and set on the table. What's in there? Fabric, Lenora said. What kind? Lenora unwrapped one corner and let the blue-flowered calico breathe for a moment in the kitchen light. Elsie's eyes went very wide. Mama, she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. That's the one. I know, Lenora said, and you're going to have the nicest dress in the county. Elsie reached out and touched the fabric very carefully, with both hands, like something that might disappear if she wasn't gentle with it. Lenora watched her, and the complicated feeling from earlier, the one, without a name, came back and settled somewhere in her chest, quieter now, less pressured. She let it stay. The written agreement arrived Thursday, as promised. It was fairer than she'd expected, honestly, though she'd never have said so. 2 weeks' wages at the front, the rest on delivery, 30 yards of calico credited against the arrangement as material costs, and a clause at the bottom in Callum Redford's unambitious handwriting that said simply, any dispute regarding payment or terms to be settled by mutual discussion, no party to act unilaterally. She'd never seen that language in any agreement before. She wasn't sure she'd ever signed something that assumed both parties would behave like adults. She signed it and started the shirts the next morning. The work was harder than she'd anticipated, not because of the sewing, but because of the organizing. Callum had sent his ranch foreman a compact, sunburned man named Holt Dubray, who wore his mustache at a permanent skeptical angle to deliver a list of measurements for the cowboys who needed shirts. And the list was 37 names long and written in at least 4 different hands, several of which she couldn't decipher. And 2 measurements had been given in units she'd never encountered. What does this say? She asked Holt, holding the paper toward him. He squinted. Which one? This one. The one that says 42.5 by I can't read this word. That's Walt Reeves. He measured himself and he's never been real good with numbers. That half is probably wrong. Probably. Maybe just make it a 43. I'll need to see him. Holt blinked. See him. For the measurement. I'm not guessing on 37 shirts. I'll ride out on Saturday if someone can have the hands who need fitting available. Holt's skeptical mustache arranged itself into something new, something she couldn't quite categorize. Ma'am, there are 37 cowboys on that list. I know. That's why I need to see them Saturday, not Sunday. Sundays I have other obligations. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, I'll tell Mr. Redford, in a tone that suggested he wasn't certain what Mr. Redford would say about this. She rode out to the Redford ranch the following Saturday with her measuring tape and her notation book, and spent 6 hours working through the list with a thoroughness that apparently caused some discussion among the hands, several of whom had expected, she gathered from the atmosphere, that the whole shirt business would be more approximate. It wasn't going to be approximate. She wrote down every measurement twice. She noted which men had broader shoulders than their chest suggested, which had arms longer than expected, which would need extra room through the back for range work. She was organized and efficient and entirely matter-of-fact about the whole thing. And by the 4th hour, the cowboys had mostly stopped being strange about it and were mostly just standing still when asked. Callum appeared around mid-afternoon, riding in from the east pasture. He saw her working through the last group of hands and stopped his horse at a distance and watched for a few minutes before riding on without saying anything. Holt Dubray found her near the barn when she'd finished and said, "You want some coffee before you ride back?" "Please," she said. They sat on the corral fence with their coffee, and Holt said, in a tone that was testing something, "You've done this before. The organizing. Not just the sewing. My husband ran a farm," she said. "Supply chains are supply chains. A farm's different from a cattle drive. Sure, more variables." She looked out at the pasture. "But the math's the same. You need X, you have Y. You figure out how to get from one to the other without losing anything you can't replace." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We're about 16 hands short for the drive. Callum's been having a hard time filling out the crew." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" He shrugged. "No particular reason." He finished his coffee. "Be good to have someone who could handle the supply end, is all." She rode home that evening through the early dark and thought about what he'd said, and when she got home she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers she'd been running for the past 2 weeks. The supply costs Callum had shared with her as part of the shirt contract, since she'd need to coordinate with the same merchants for the material, and something started to bother her. She didn't know what it was yet. Just a feeling. A number that didn't land quite right when she added it to the others. She wrote it down in the margin and told herself she'd look at it again tomorrow. It was the kind of thing that felt small until it didn't. The shirts took 3 weeks. Not because she was slow, she worked from 5 in the morning until the light failed, and some nights by lamp, but because she made them right. Double-stitched at the shoulders. Buttons secured with cross-thread backing so they wouldn't pull loose after the second wash. She'd watched Thomas lose buttons off cheap Soon shirts for 10 years, and she had specific feelings about it. She delivered them on a Tuesday, stacked in 2 flat crates that she and Elsie had loaded into the wagon before dawn. Holt met her at the ranch gate. He lifted the cover on the first crate and looked at the shirts for a long moment. Then he lifted one out and turned it over in his hands. "These are the best-made shirts I've seen on this ranch," he said finally. "They'll hold up," she said. "If they don't, bring them back and I'll fix them for nothing." "I don't think they'll need fixing." Callum came out of the house while they were unloading. He looked at the crates and then at Lenora. "Holt said you took full measurements." It seemed like the right approach. He also said you made notes on the supply invoices. She met his eyes. "I did." She stopped. "There's something I want to ask you about. When you have time." He looked at her for a moment. "Come inside." They sat at the large kitchen table in the ranch house, a room that showed the signs of a house run by men. Clean enough, but without any particular interest in comfort, and she pulled out the invoice copies she'd been working from and spread them on the table. "I've been looking at your feed costs," she said, "for the past 3 years. And?" She put her finger on a column of numbers. "These are high. Feed's expensive. This is more than expensive." She paused. "Mr. Redford, have you compared these costs with what independent farmers in the county are charging?" Not the suppliers Sutter brokers through. The actual farmers. Callum looked at the paper. His face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Lenora said carefully, "that someone has been charging you a great deal more than the market rate for a very long time. And I'm saying that whoever it is has access to your account arrangements in a way that suggests it's not accidental." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, one of the hands called something to another across the yard, and a horse answered from the corral. "Bramwell Sutter handles our supply brokering," Callum said, in a voice that was working hard at being neutral. "Has for 6 years, I know." She kept her own voice even. That's why I wanted to talk to you before I said it to anyone else." He looked at her for a long time. "How sure are you?" he said. "Sure enough to be sitting in your kitchen, saying it out loud," she said. "Not sure enough to accuse anyone of anything." "Not yet." He nodded. Slowly, he looked out the window at the yard, at the hands going about their work, at the visible edge of the pasture where his cattle moved like a slow brown river. "What would you need?" he said finally, to be sure. She thought about it. 3 years of invoices. All of them. Not the summaries, the originals. And the names of any independent suppliers within 2 counties who might be willing to talk. That's going to take time. I know. The drive is in 2 months. She folded her hands on the table. It's enough time if we start now. Callum looked at her. Then he stood up, walked to the large wooden cabinet against the far wall, opened it, and pulled out a stacked file of papers that was held together by 2 leather straps, and clearly hadn't been fully examined in some time. He set it on the table in front of her. "Where do you want to start?" he said. Lenora opened the file. The kitchen lamp flickered once. And somewhere, 8 miles away in a comfortable office above the feed store, Bramwell Sutter sat reviewing his own accounts with no idea that a widow with 63 cents in a cracked teacup had just started taking his empire apart. The file Callum had dropped on the kitchen table was a mess. Not deliberately, it was just the mess of a man who ran a large operation and trusted other people to handle the paper end of it. Invoices, mixed with freight receipts, mixed with correspondence, mixed with what appeared to be, at one point, a shopping list for fence posts. Lenora spent the first 20 minutes just sorting the papers into years, smoothing the folded ones flat against the table edge, setting aside the ones that weren't invoices at all. Callum sat across from her with a coffee cup he'd stopped drinking from and watched her work. "You don't have to stay," she said, without looking up. "It's my table." Fair enough. She kept sorting. He kept watching. After a while, he got up and refilled his coffee and brought the pot back and set it between them, without asking, which she appreciated because she didn't want to stop and ask for it herself. The picture that started to emerge from the invoices was not dramatic. That was the first thing she noticed. There was nothing obviously wrong, no single number that jumped out and announced itself as fraudulent. It was subtler than that. It was the kind of thing you'd only see if you were looking at 3 years of numbers side by side, if you had the patience to add each column and then add it again, if you knew what feed was actually worth, because you'd been buying it in smaller quantities for your own farm, and you knew what the farmers charged before a broker touched it. She made 2 columns on a piece of blank paper she found in the stack. What Callum had been charged, what she estimated the actual market price to be. She worked slowly, double-checking her figures, and the gap between the 2 columns grew with every row she added. By the time she reached the end of the second year's invoices, she had to stop and just look at the number at the bottom of the page for a moment. "What is it?" Callum said. She turned the paper so he could see it. He looked at it. His jaw tightened slightly. "That's in 1 year." "That's in 1 year," she confirmed. "And that's just feed and winter supply. I haven't touched the freight figures yet." He set his coffee cup down. "The freight figures are going to be worse, aren't they?" "I think so, yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sun had shifted enough that the light through the kitchen window had changed angle, which meant it was past noon, and she'd been there for 3 hours. She'd told Elsie she'd be back by 2. She needed to start wrapping up. "Mr. Redford," she said, "I have to go soon, but I'd like to take some of these invoices with me to work from at home, if you're agreeable. Take whatever you need. I'll be careful with them. I know you will." He looked at the paper with the 2 columns on it, still sitting in the middle of the table. Lenora. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and he seemed aware of it. There was a slight adjustment in his expression, not quite an apology, but something adjacent. "How long do you think he's been doing this?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. Longer than 3 years, probably. But 3 years is what we have. That's enough. She gathered the invoices she needed into a careful stack and wrapped them with the leather strap from the file and put them in her bag. She just straightened her coat and said, "I'll have numbers for you by the end of the week." "I'll come to you," he said. "I don't want you riding back out here alone with those papers." She looked at him. "I've been riding alone since I was 12. That's not what I meant." She understood then what he did mean. If Sutter had people watching, and a man who'd been running a scheme this long would have some form of awareness about his exposure, a widow riding away from Redford Ranch with a bag full of invoices was a thing that might get noticed. Friday evening, she said. Elsie will be at her friend's house. He nodded. Friday. She drove home with the invoices in her bag, and the number from that page sitting in the front of her mind like something with weight to it. By the time she reached Whitfield Hollow, she'd already worked out what she needed to do next, and she spent the rest of the afternoon at the kitchen table, with fresh paper and her sharpest pencil, building a picture. What Bramwell Sutter had built was not complicated exactly. It just relied on no one ever looking at the whole of it at once. He controlled 3 merchants in Alder Creek, Hartley at the Mercantile, the feed store, and the freight company through a combination of exclusive supplier agreements, and, Lenora suspected, arrangements of a financial nature that she couldn't prove yet, but that she could feel in the numbers, the way you feel a bad tooth before it actually hurts. The merchants bought from suppliers that Sutter brokered, at prices set by Sutter, and Sutter's brokerage fee was not disclosed to the ranchers who were ultimately paying it. That wasn't necessarily illegal on its own. The illegal part, and it was illegal, she was increasingly certain, was that Sutter had been falsifying the underlying supplier costs. He wasn't just marking up. He was inventing numbers. The actual suppliers were charging one price. The invoices reaching Callum's accounts showed another price entirely, and the difference went somewhere that wasn't into any merchant's pocket. The independent farmers, she'd spoken to 2 of them, cautiously, in conversations that she'd framed as inquiries about supplying the spring shirts contract, had confirmed what she suspected. Their selling prices bore no relationship to what Callum had been charged. One of them, an older woman named Bertha Olson, who farmed grain 12 miles south of Alder Creek, had looked at the number Lenora quoted and laughed outright. "That's what he's charging for my grain?" Bertha said. "Lord, I've been selling to Sutter's man for 4 years and never seen half that. Would you be willing to say that in front of other people?" Lenora asked. "Ranchers, merchants, maybe more formal than that." Bertha looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing a lot of calculation behind steady eyes. "Depends on what you mean by formal. I mean legal. I mean documented." Another pause. "My cousin's husband is a lawyer, over in Millhaven." "That might be useful," Lenora said. "Might be," Bertha agreed. "And then, Sutter ever find out you're asking around, you're going to have a problem." "I know," Lenora said. "You don't look like someone who scares easy." "I'm scared right now," Lenora said honestly. "I'm just doing it anyway." Bertha seemed to find this acceptable. "All right," she said. "Come back when you're ready to talk serious." Friday came and Callum sat at Lenora's kitchen table, in the same way he'd sat at his own, not quite comfortable, not quite formal, just present in the particular way of someone who was paying genuine attention. She walked him through her full accounting of 3 years of Redford Ranch supply costs, set against the farmer testimonials, and the market prices she'd compiled. She'd organized it clearly, column by column, no flourish, no drama. Just the numbers doing what numbers do when you lay them out honestly. When she finished, Callum sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "If I go to confront him," he said, "he'll know we know. He'll move the money, destroy what records he has, and we'll have nothing that holds in front of a judge." "Yes," Lenora said. "So what do we do?" She'd been thinking about this for 4 days. She'd thought about it while sewing, while cooking, while lying awake past midnight, listening to the quiet of the house. She'd come at it from every angle she could imagine, and she kept arriving at the same place. "We let him believe it's still working," she said. Callum looked at her. "Say that again." "We let him think the scheme is running the way it always has. You announce the cattle drive, biggest you've done in years. Make sure word travels. He'll expect you to go through his suppliers like always. Only you don't." She smoothed the edge of the paper in front of her. "I've already spoken to Bertha Olson. She can supply the grain we need directly, no broker involved. There are 2 other farmers I haven't approached yet, but I think they'll agree. We purchase the drive supplies ourselves, independently, and we keep every receipt and every invoice." "And Sutter?" "Sutter sees a big drive announced and expects big orders coming through his network. When they don't come, he's going to start asking questions. And when he starts asking questions," she looked at Callum directly, "he's going to do something visible, something we can document." Callum was quiet for a long moment. "That's a risk," he said. "Yes. If he gets ahead of it, figures out what we're doing." "I know." She didn't soften it. "It's the option that gives us the best chance of building something that holds. Confronting him directly just makes him defensive and gives him time to clean house. This way, we control the timing." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a habit she'd noticed he did it when he was thinking through something he didn't fully like but could see the logic of. "You've been talking to farmers already," he said. "Without consulting me." She held his gaze. "I've been preparing. It's not the same as committing. It's close. Is that a problem?" He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said finally. "It's not." He set the cup down. "What do you need from me?" "The drive announcement needs to be public, and it needs to be big. Let Sutter hear about it from 3 directions. I'll handle the independent supply arrangements if you'll trust me to negotiate." "I'll trust you to negotiate," he said, without hesitating, which was either very easy confidence or a considered decision she wasn't sure which, and either way it landed somewhere she wasn't entirely prepared for. "There's another thing," she said. "Go ahead. When this comes out, and it will come out, one way or the other it's going to be ugly. People are going to say things about why a widow had access to your accounts." He looked at her steadily. "Let them. They're already saying things," she said. "Half of Alder Creek thinks I'm—" She stopped. Started again. "Mrs. Aldridge told the postmaster that I was making eyes at you to get my mortgage settled." A pause. "Is that what you're doing? Don't be foolish." Something shifted at the edge of his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the vicinity of one. "I know that. I'm asking so you know I know that." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "We understand each other, we do. Then let's talk about the drive announcement." The gossip started the following week, which was faster than Lenora had expected and slower than she'd feared. It began as Alder Creek gossip usually began, at the Mercantile. Someone she never found out who, though she had suspicions mentioned to Emmett Hartley that Callum Redford's widow hire had been seen riding out to the ranch twice in 1 week, and that she'd been seen leaving with papers, and that Callum had been seen at Whitfield Hollow on a Friday evening and hadn't left until after dark. By the time it reached Lenora, the story had accumulated several details that bore no relationship to anything that had actually occurred. She was prepared for this, approximately. She'd been a widow in a small town, long enough to understand that her existence required a kind of ongoing management that married women were largely exempt from. Every decision she made in public where she walked, who she spoke to, what she wore, what she carried was subject to a level of scrutiny that was exhausting and constant and had no endpoint. What she hadn't been fully prepared for was the speed with which the gossip translated into practical consequences. The first sign was at the dry goods store. She'd placed an order the previous month for a particular thread she used for the blanket repairs, and when she went to collect it, the owner, a thin man named Cresswell, who had always been indifferent but tolerable, told her the order hadn't come in. "When will it be in?" she asked. "Hard to say," he said, and turned to help someone else. She went back the following week. The order still hadn't come in. She asked to see the shipping receipt, and he told her he didn't have one to show her, and the way he said it made clear that showing her was not something he intended to do regardless. She placed the same order with a store in the next town over and rode the 12 miles to collect it herself. The second sign was worse. A lumber merchant she'd been speaking with about a small contract, nothing large, just supplies for a repair on the Whitfield barn, sent word that he'd decided not to take on new accounts at this time. The phrasing was polite and said nothing specific, and she could prove nothing specific, but she knew. She was being squeezed, and the squeezing was coordinated. She didn't tell Callum right away. She needed to think about it first, whether telling him would help, whether it might prompt him to move too fast, whether the pressure was actually a signal that Sutter was already aware something was off, or whether it was simply the normal social machinery of a small town grinding against a widow who'd stepped out of the lane assigned to her. After 4 days, she decided it was probably both, and she told Callum. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'll speak to Cresswell." "Don't," she said immediately. "He's refusing to fill a legitimate order. If you go to Cresswell, Sutter knows we know." She kept her voice flat. "Nothing we're doing makes sense if we lose the element of surprise. We can't lose it over thread." He looked frustrated in the contained way he did most things. "Lenora, they're interfering with your business." "Yes. And it's not pleasant. And we're going to handle it through the legal case we're building, not by having you ride into town and put pressure on a small-time merchant who's scared of his broker." She met his eyes. "I can source the thread elsewhere. I can source everything elsewhere. That's actually useful to us. It shows a pattern of coordinated behavior against anyone connected to you." He looked at her for a long moment. You're keeping notes. I'm keeping notes on everything, including this conversation. Not this one specifically. Something shifted in the room, something small, like a pressure change before weather. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something more uncertain than his usual steadiness, and she wasn't sure what to do with it, so she looked back at the papers on the table. "The drive announcement is working," she said. "I heard from Holt that Sutter's agent came by the ranch yesterday asking about supply orders." "Dooley," Callum said. "Sutter's man. He came by around noon, asked Holt when they'd be placing orders for the drive. Holt told him we were still in planning stages." "Good." She wrote something down. "That buys us another 2 or 3 weeks before he starts pushing harder. And our independent suppliers? Where are we?" She flipped to another page. "Bertha Olson is confirmed for grain. I spoke with a farmer named Hicks Josiah Hicks. He's about 15 miles south, who can supply dried provisions and some winter stores. I'm still working on the replacement for Sutter's freight connection. That one's harder." "Freight's the problem," Callum agreed. "There are only 2 companies operating this route." "I know. But I spoke with a man at the livery who said his brother-in-law runs mule teams out of Cooper's Crossing and might be interested in a new contract." She looked up. "I need to ride to Cooper's Crossing. I'll come with you." "That's not necessary." "It's not about necessary," he said. "It's about how it looks when you show up alone to negotiate a freight contract for a major cattle drive. The man's more likely to take you seriously if I'm there." She wanted to argue with this. She knew he was right, which was a particular kind of annoying. "Fine," she said. "Thursday." The trouble with Bramwell Sutter was that he was not a stupid man. Lenora had made the mistake, initially, of thinking that someone who ran a long-term price-fixing scheme must be bold and reckless, the kind of person who got greedy and careless. Sutter wasn't either. He was patient, methodical, and had been operating this way long enough that it had become, in his mind, simply the way things worked. He was not stealing, from his perspective. He was optimizing. He was providing a service and extracting a fee commensurate with the service's value. And if the people paying the fee didn't know the exact nature of the calculation, well, that was their failure to ask the right questions. He was 62 years old and had been in Alder Creek for 20 years and had never, not once, had anyone look carefully at his numbers. This was both his great advantage and, Lenora was betting, his great blind spot. The thing that gave her confidence was not Sutter's intelligence. It was his arrogance. He'd been getting away with this for so long that he couldn't quite imagine the mechanics of being caught. He could imagine accusation. That was why he had the town relationships, the merchant agreements, the social architecture of respectability that surrounded him like a wall. What he couldn't imagine was documentation. He couldn't imagine that someone had been quietly building a parallel accounting of everything he'd done for the past 3 years, cross-referencing it with farmer testimony and shipping records and the second-hand invoices he'd never thought to collect from the merchants who handled his arrangements. He couldn't imagine it because the person doing it was a widow in a patched coat who he'd never spoken to directly and whose existence had never registered on his accounting of who, in Alder Creek, was worth watching. That was the 30 yards of calico in another form, invisible till it wasn't. The Cooper's Crossing trip happened on Thursday, as planned. The man's brother-in-law, a weathered, straightforward person named Mort Cale, who ran 8 mule teams and smelled comprehensively of animals, turned out to be both interested in the contract and deeply suspicious of Callum, which surprised Lenora until she realized that Mort Cale probably had his own freight business affected by the same Sutter-controlled routes, and that Callum Redford, as one of the county's largest ranchers, would be assumed to be complicit in any arrangement that favored large operators. She handled it. She'd expected the dynamic, roughly, and she let Callum stand slightly to one side while she walked Mort through the route, the tonnage, the timeline, and the payment terms. She answered his questions directly.
He pushed back on price. She held her ground with enough
specificity, stopped testing, and started negotiating in good faith. They rode back from Cooper's Crossing with a freight agreement signed and folded in Lenora's bag, and Callum was quiet for most of the first 3 miles. "You didn't need me there," he said finally. "I told you that." "You did." Another pause. "You handled Mort Cale better than I would have." She glanced at him sideways. "He was suspicious of you." "I'm not something he had a prepared response for." "The invisible thing," Callum said. She looked at him sharply. "What?" He seemed to realize he'd said something unexpected. I've been thinking about what you said, about how Sutter never thought to watch you. You said it was because you were invisible to him. I said nothing like that. Not in those words. He looked at the road ahead. You said he couldn't imagine the person doing it, because of who you are. She was quiet for a moment. It's not a virtue. It's just how the world is arranged. I know. He glanced at her. I'm not calling it a virtue. I'm saying you know how to work in the space it creates. She thought about Elsie standing at the calico with her hand up, not touching. About what it cost a person, year after year, to navigate the space that other people didn't see as a space at all, but simply as your proper position. Don't romanticize it, she said, more sharply than she intended. I'm not. He said it quietly, without defensiveness, and she believed him. They rode the rest of the way without talking, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which she noted with a degree of unease she didn't particularly examine. The ranch drive announcement ran in the county paper. 2 weeks later, Redford Ranch, largest cattle drive in 4 years' spring departure, 800 head. It was the kind of announcement that traveled fast, through the feed store and the mercantile, and the conversations at the barber and the post office. And by the end of the week, it had reached Bramwell Sutter's desk in a way that had the intended effect. Sutter sent his man Dooley to the ranch 3 days after the announcement. Holt turned him away politely, said they were still organizing. Dooley came back the following week. Holt said the same thing. Dooley, on his third visit, asked directly whether they'd placed orders with anyone yet. Holt said he didn't know the details of the supply arrangement, which was technically true, and suggested Dooley's speak to Mr. Redford directly. Dooley did not want to speak to Mr. Redford directly. Callum had that effect on people who were doing something they'd prefer not to discuss face to face. Sutter's response when it came was not through Dooley. Lenora was at the mercantile. She still needed to shop there, because there were certain goods Emmett Hartley stocked that she couldn't easily source elsewhere, and stopping entirely would distill something. When Cordelia Varn came in, with a woman Lenora hadn't seen before. Taller, well-dressed, with the particular look of someone who'd come from money and wore it carefully. Cordelia introduced her to Emmett as a cousin visiting from Cheyenne, and the conversation that followed was friendly and ordinary and completely beside the point. The point was that on the way out, Cordelia stopped near where Lenora was looking at bolts of cotton and said, in a voice pitched for Lenora specifically, I understand Callum Redford is planning a big drive this spring. You must know all about it, being his, housekeeper? Secretary? Lenora kept her eyes on the fabric, supply manager. Cordelia made a sound. How modern. A widow running supplies for a cattle ranch. I suppose times do change. A pause. Mrs. Redford wouldn't have approved, I imagine. Lenora turned and looked at Cordelia directly. Mrs. Redford has been gone 12 years, and you're going to want to be careful about what you're implying in front of witnesses. Cordelia blinked. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Lenora kept her voice conversational. And I think whoever put you up to this, whether it was a social call or something with more organization behind it, might want to know that I notice things. I notice a great deal of things, and I write them down. She picked up her parcel and walked to the counter to pay. Behind her, she heard Cordelia say something to her cousin in a lowered voice, and she didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. Sutter was nervous enough to use a social proxy. That meant they were closer than she'd thought to whatever point he was going to do something visible and provable. She paid for her goods and walked out into the afternoon light, and she thought, 2 weeks, maybe 3. She was right about the timing. She was wrong about the form it would take. Callum found her at Whitfield Hollow on a Wednesday morning, riding in hard enough that she came out of the house to meet him before he'd fully stopped his horse. 3 of my contracted drovers pulled out, he said. She felt it land in her chest like something cold. When? Last night. Letters. All 3. Same excuse, different arrangements. Won't be available for the drive. Apologies for the late notice. He dismounted and looked at her with an expression that was controlled and very unhappy. They've been driving for me for years. 2 of them I've known since before the ranch was half its size. Someone got to them, she said. Someone got to them. He handed her one of the letters. Read the second line. She read it. Given the uncertainty surrounding the current season's arrangements, I feel it prudent to secure more established contracts before the weather window closes. Uncertainty surrounding current arrangements, she said. Someone told them something. Not specifics. If they knew specifics, they wouldn't have cited uncertainty. They'd have cited it directly. just enough to make them nervous. She handed the letter back. Her mind was moving fast through the timeline. The drive was 6 weeks out. They needed those drovers. She ran the numbers on what 3 missing drovers meant for moving 800 head of cattle through mountain country before an early winter, and the numbers were not good. How many more can you recruit in 6 weeks? Maybe 1. 2 if I'm lucky. Drovers don't grow on trees, especially this close to drive season. Then we have a problem. Yes, he looked at her. Do we change the plan? She thought about Bertha Olson and her grain, about Mort Kale and his mule teams, about the invoices stacked in her bag, and 3 years of farmers who'd been selling low while ranchers paid high, and Bramwell Sutter sat in his office and called it business. No, she said, we adjust. But we don't change the plan. He looked at her steadily. We're down 3 drovers, and the snow window is already narrow. I know, this isn't theoretical risk anymore. This is the drive going wrong in ways that cost real money. I know that too. She looked back at him with the same steadiness. Do you trust what we're building? The case against Sutter? A pause. Yes, then we hold the course. Because if we pull back now, we lose the element of surprise, and we lose the supply chain we've built. And we go back to him, knowing he can push us off anything he wants to protect. She crossed her arms against the morning chill. He just showed us he's scared enough to interfere with your drovers. That means we're close enough that he's trying to stop us. That's not a reason to retreat. Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, you know, when I rode out to Whitfield Hollow with 30 yards of calico and a half-made plan, I thought I was doing you a favor. You were, she said. I don't think that's how it turned out. She didn't say anything to that. He remounted his horse and turned it toward the road, and then he stopped and looked back. 6 weeks, he said. Whatever happens, we move the herd in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she agreed. He rode out. Lenora went inside and sat at the kitchen table with her papers and her pencil and her list of everything they still needed to make it work, and she started on the things she could fix today, because that was what there was to do. The morning light moved across the table as she worked, and the numbers slowly began to take shape again, and somewhere to the east, 8 miles away, Callum Redford was already figuring out how to move 800 cattle through a closing mountain pass with fewer hands than he needed. Neither of them had any margin left to give. They both knew it, and neither of them said so out loud, which was, in its own way, its own kind of agreement. The drover's letters sat on Callum's desk for 2 days before he stopped looking at them. Not because he'd accepted the situation he hadn't, not entirely, but because staring at them wasn't going to put the men back on his payroll, and there was too much else that needed doing to spend time being angry at paper. He'd built the ranch on a particular discipline. When something broke, you assessed the damage, figured out what you still had that worked, and moved from there. Grief and fury were for after the drive, not before it. He needed drovers. He had 6 weeks. He sent Holt Dubray out the same afternoon, with instructions to ride to every ranch within 2 days' travel, and ask quietly whether anyone had experienced a similar sudden departure from tracted hands. Not as an accusation of anything specific, just as a question. The kind of question that, depending on the answer, would tell him whether this was a coordinated effort or an isolated move against him specifically. Holt came back 4 days later with an answer that was worse than either option. It was both. 2 other ranchers, Macon Pruitt, who ran about 400 head northeast of Alder Creek, and a woman named Ida Fenwick, who had the Fenwick spread along the river bottom, had each lost 1 contracted drover in the past 10 days. Different letters, similar language. Uncertainty in the current season's arrangements. Same phrasing, different hands. Whoever had written the template had been careful about that, at least. Callum rode to Whitfield Hollow that evening and told Lenora what Holt had found. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the notes she'd been keeping, and then she said, "He's not just trying to slow down the drive. He's trying to create a labor shortage across multiple operations so he can position himself as the solution." How do you mean? If ranchers can't get drovers, they need someone to broker the connection. If Sutter can corner the drover market the same way he's cornered the supply market, she stopped. He's expanding. This isn't just about protecting his arrangement with you. He's using your drive announcement as a reason to move into something bigger. Callum looked at her. He's got drovers on his books? He's getting them, she said. That's my guess. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, he's been making arrangements. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. How many drovers does Macon Pruitt need? For his drive? 8-10. And Ida Fenwick? 6, maybe. Her operation smaller. Lenora wrote the numbers down. If Sutter can present himself as the man who solves a regional drover shortage right before drive season, every rancher in the county is going to owe him something. And owing Sutter something means paying Sutter something. She set her pencil down. We have to move faster. The supply arrangements are solid. Bertha Olson is ready. Mort Kale is ready. Josiah Hicks confirmed last Tuesday. She looked up. The problem isn't the supplies. The problem is that in 6 weeks, we need enough hands to move 800 head through the high pass. And Sutter just took 3 of yours and is probably going to try to take more. Callum was quiet. How many drovers do you have left that are solid, she asked. 14 committed. I can trust 12 of them completely. The other 2, he paused. I don't know. After the letters, I don't know who else he might have approached. You need to find out. I know, quietly, without making anyone feel accused. She looked at him directly. Can Holt do that? Holt can do most things quietly. Then set him on it, and tell him to ask specifically about a man named Dooley Sutter's agent, whether any of the hands have been approached by him in the past month. Callum looked at her. You think he went to them directly? I think Sutter is careful enough not to go himself, and Dooley is his instrument for anything he doesn't want attached to his name. Yes. She folded her hands on the table. And Callum, if Holt finds anyone who's been approached and said, no, give them something to stay. Raise their pay if you have to. We cannot lose more hands before this drive. He nodded. What about the people who might have already said yes? Let them go, she said. Someone willing to leave that close to the drive for Sutter's arrangement is someone you can't rely on in the mountains anyway. He sat back and looked at her with an expression she'd seen on him a few times, now not quite surprised, more like someone recalibrating a measurement they'd thought was already accurate. You said 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she confirmed. And we need to do one more thing. What? Macon Pruitt and Ida Fenwick, she said. We need to tell them what we know. That conversation was harder than the others. Callum rode out to Pruitt's ranch first, alone, because Lenora had said it would land better coming from one rancher to another without a widow. In the picture complicating things which she'd said without particular bitterness, just as a practical observation about how men like Macon Pruitt received information. Callum had not argued with her, which she noted. Pruitt was a broad-shouldered, suspicious man of 58 who had built his operation without help from anyone, and who considered most offers of information to be a form of leverage in disguise. He listened to Callum for 20 minutes and then said, So you're saying Sutter's been robbing us both? I'm saying there's evidence suggesting the supply costs we've both been paying are significantly above market, Callum said. That's the same thing in longer words. Maybe. I wanted to show you the documentation before I called it anything. Pruitt looked at the invoice comparison. Callum had brought Lenora's careful columns, 3 years of numbers, and was quiet for a long time. This is the widow's work, he said finally. She compiled it. She any good? Better than anyone I've had access to. Pruitt looked at the papers again. My drover situation. Connected, Callum said. We think. You think. Pruitt turned a page. What do you want from me? Nothing yet. I'm telling you so you can protect yourself. And so you know that when this comes out publicly, you'll have the same documentation I have. When not if, when Callum said, yes. Pruitt was quiet for another moment. Ida Fenwick know about this? Not yet. You're first. Something in Pruitt's expression shifted not warmly, but in the direction of something that might eventually get there. I'll write out to Ida's myself, he said. We have a better working relationship than you and her do. That's fine, Callum said. However it reaches her. He rode home and told Lenora. She nodded and wrote something in her notes and said, Good. Now we wait and see what Sutter does when he realizes his labor strategy isn't producing the results he wanted. How will we know when he realizes that? She looked up from the papers. He'll do something louder, she said simply. She was right. She was right within the week. Sutter's louder move came in the form of a visit. Not to Callum directly. Sutter was still too careful for that. He came to the Redford Ranch on a Thursday morning with a smile and a handshake and a specific kind of friendliness that arrived preloaded with implication. Holt sent for Callum immediately, and Callum came in from the east pasture with mud on his boots and no particular expression on his face. Bramwell, he said. This is unexpected. I was in the area. Sutter was 62, silver-haired, and impeccably turned out for a man who'd supposedly been passing through. He had the politician's handshake, one hand on the grip, one on the forearm, Eye contact held a second longer than natural. Wanted to congratulate you on the drive announcement. 800 head. Ambitious. We do what the market calls for. Absolutely. Absolutely. Sutter looked around the yard with the proprietary interest of someone conducting an assessment. I understand you've been exploring some alternative supply arrangements? For the drive? The word alternative had a specific weight to it. Callum kept his face entirely neutral. We're still in planning stages. Of course. Sutter smiled. I only ask because my office has been in contact with several of your usual suppliers, and there seems to be some confusion about the order schedule. I'd hate for you to hit a supply gap right before departure. There won't be a supply gap. I'm sure there won't. But if anything does develop, he produced a card from his coat pocket and held it out. My office handles expedited arrangements. For a reasonable fee, we can move quickly when timelines are tight. Callum looked at the card, did not take it. A moment passed. Sutter kept the card extended with the patience of someone accustomed to people eventually taking what he offered. Callum said, I'll keep it in mind, and did not reach for it. Sutter withdrew the card. His smile remained, but something behind it adjusted, the way a room adjusts when a window is closed. Of course. Well, I won't take up your time. He looked toward the main road. Terrible business about your drovers, by the way. I heard a few of your contracts fell through. These things happen. They do. Sutter turned back with the smile intact. I may know a few experienced men who are between engagements if you find yourself short-handed. Experienced drovers are hard to find this close to season. There it was. The shape of the thing, offered in the most polite possible terms. He'd taken the drovers, and now he was selling them back. The only question was what the price would be, and the price was clearly not going to be stated in this conversation. Callum looked at Sutter with the particular stillness he'd developed over 41 years of dealing with difficult animals and difficult people, which required the same fundamental approach. Don't show the reaction. Don't give the opening. Wait. If we need hands, I'll reach out, he said. Wonderful. Sutter took his leave with the same handshake arm grip, eye contact, and rode off down the main road. Holt appeared from around the corner of the barn about 30 seconds after Sutter's horse was out of sight. That was the most uncomfortable thing I've watched in 10 years, he said. Did anyone speak to him besides me? No, I made sure of it. Good. Callum turned toward the house. Get word to Lenora. Today, if possible. Lenora received Holt's message via a ranch hand, who arrived at Whitfield Hollow around mid-afternoon and relayed the visit in what was clearly a second-hand account, but close enough to useful. She spent the next hour going back through her documentation with new focus. What Sutter had done by coming to the ranch was reveal several things at once. He was not as confident as his social position suggested. A man with genuine security doesn't make personal visits to reinforce the leverage he theoretically holds. He was also, for the first time, overtly naming the drover situation, which meant he was past the phase of wanting plausible deniability about it. He knew Callum had made the connection. He was betting Callum would blink. She wrote all of this down, dated it, and added it to the file. Then she made a decision she'd been considering for 4 days and had been postponing because it had a permanent quality to it. Once she did it, the situation would move faster than she could fully control, and faster meant more risk. She wrote a letter to Bertha Olson's cousin's husband, the lawyer in Millhaven. She wrote it carefully, keeping the language precise and confined to what she could document, making no accusations she couldn't support with paper. She described the supply cost discrepancy, the 3 years of invoices, the farmer testimonials. She described the sudden drover withdrawals and their geographic pattern. She described Sutter's visit to the ranch and the specific language he'd used. She explained what she believed the complete picture showed about the nature of the scheme and asked us whether what she'd described constituted grounds for a formal inquiry. She sealed it, addressed it, and gave it to Elsie to take to the post office the following morning because she herself was not going to stand at the Alder Creek post office counter and hand over a letter addressed to a lawyer in another town and let Emmett Hartley, who saw everything that moved through that post office and who Lenora did not entirely trust, register it. Don't go in, she told Elsie. Put it in the box on the outside. Can you do that? Yes, Elsie said. Why can't you go in? Because I'm busy. Elsie looked at her with the particular look she'd developed lately, sharper than a 9-year-old's look had any business being, which was something Lenora felt complicated about, and said, You're sending something you don't want, mister. Hartley to see. I'm sending a letter, Lenora said. Go straight there and straight back. Elsie went straight there and straight back, and the letter began its journey to Millhaven. The night before the drive was scheduled to depart, someone cut the brake lines on 2 of the supply wagons. Lenora found it at 4 in the morning because she'd ridden out to the Redford ranch the previous afternoon and stayed to oversee the final loading. And she'd woken at 3:30 with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had been working through the night, even while she slept. She'd gone out to the wagons to check the load distribution. One more time she'd been bothered by the weight calculation on the second wagon, since she'd finished the numbers the evening before, and she'd found the cut lines when she crouched down with her lamp to check the wheel assembly. Clean cuts. Not wear, not accident. She stood up and stood very still for a moment in the cold pre-dawn dark, and then she went and knocked on Holt DeBray's bunkhouse door. "Get up," she said. "We have a problem." Holt was awake and dressed in 4 minutes, which told her something useful about how he slept these days. He looked at the lines with his own lamp and said a word she was fairly sure she wasn't meant to hear, and then said, "Who else knows you found this? You're the first. Don't tell Callum until I've checked the other wagons." "I already checked the other wagons," she said. "It's only these 2. They're the ones with the emergency grain and the winter blankets, the critical stores." Holt looked at her. So someone knew the load assignments. Yes. She'd been working that thought since she stood up from the wagon. Someone had known not just that there were supply wagons, but which wagons carried what. That was either a very lucky guess based on which wagons were most heavily loaded, or it was someone with specific knowledge. "The load assignments were posted in the main barn," Holt said. "Yesterday afternoon." Who had access to the barn yesterday afternoon? Holt's jaw tightened. Everyone. The whole crew was in and out loading. She thought about what Callum had said, 12 hands he trusted completely, 2 he wasn't sure about. "Wake Callum," she said. Quietly, he went, she stayed with the wagons. Callum appeared 7 minutes later in his coat over his work clothes, lamp in hand, and crouched down to look at the lines without being told what he was looking at. He ran his thumb along the cut edge and then stood up. "How long to fix them?" he said. 2 hours if we have the right parts," Holt said. "Maybe 3. Do we have the right parts?" "I'll know in 5 minutes." Callum looked at Lenora. "Departure's at 6. "I know. If we're not on the road by 7, we lose the whole first day's timing, and the timing is already tight with the short crew." "I know." She met his eyes. "Holt, go check the parts. We'll figure out the timing from there." Holt went. They stood in the dark beside the damaged wagons, and Callum said very quietly, "Someone in my crew did this. Maybe. Or someone got into the barn last night who wasn't part of your crew." "You believe that?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I think it's more likely it was someone Sutter approached, and someone said yes after all. But I can't prove it yet." She looked at the wagons. "The damage is specific. It's not the act of someone who just wanted to cause chaos. They targeted the critical supply wagons. That takes knowledge and intent. Can we still move the drive?" She'd been calculating since she stood up from the crouched position. "Yes, but not the way we planned." She turned and looked at the yard, the barn, the corrals, the pre-dawn shapes of 800 cattle in the far field. "We need to reroute." Callum looked at her. "The mountain pass is the only clear route before the blizzard window." "The main pass, yes. But there's an old stage route that comes off Corbell Ridge, about 2 miles north of the main road, follows Sawmill Creek through the lower elevation, and comes out east of the pass above Redding Flat." She watched his face. "You know it? That route hasn't been used in 15 years. The terrain is harder on the cattle in the first section, yes. But it avoids the 2 elevation points where a blizzard catches you worst. And it comes out ahead of the Redding Flat station, where Mort Cale has already positioned the 2nd Freight Team. She'd mapped this 3 weeks ago as a contingency, on a night when she couldn't sleep and had decided to stop fighting the insomnia and use it for something. It adds half a day on the front end. It saves potentially 2 days of risk on the back end. He looked at her. "You planned for this." "I planned for several things going wrong," she said. "This is one of them." Holt came back at a run. "We've got the parts." 2 hours. Maybe less if I pull 2 good hands off other prep. "Do it," Callum said. "Pull whoever you need." He looked at Lenora. "The Corbell route. You have the full map in my bag." "Get it." They spread the map on the tailgate of the 3rd wagon with 2 lamps between them, and Callum studied it the way he studied most things thoroughly and without rushing, even with the dark still pressing around them and the clock running against them from every direction. "The section through Sawmill Creek," he said. The crossing. 3 crossings. First one's reliable year-round. Second is she put her finger on the map. Probably 18 inches deep at this time of year. The cattle can cross, but it'll slow them. Probably 18 inches, he repeated. I've looked at the creek records from the county land office for the past 20 years. This time of year, it runs between 14 and 22 inches. 18 is the median. And if it's running 22, then we lose 2 more hours and the rear guard gets wet, she said. And we still make the railhead before the pass closes. He looked at the map for another moment. Then he straightened. We take the Corbell route. Okay. When the crew wakes, I'll tell them the route change is due to a reported rock fall on the main road. I don't want anyone knowing about the brake lines until after the drive. She nodded. Whoever did it will know the route change isn't because of a rock fall. Yes, and they'll know we found it. That's fine. His expression was steady, but with something hard underneath it. They can know we found it. What they won't know is that it doesn't change anything. Holt took 2 men to the wagon repairs. The rest of the crew woke at 5 to find Callum already mounted, and Lenora standing at the map board with the rerouted drive pinned up and clear. There were questions. There were always questions when a plan changed the morning of departure. She answered them the same way she'd been answering questions for the past 6 weeks, directly, with specific numbers, and without indicating that there was any reason to doubt the plan's workability. The hands were good men, most of them. They grumbled the way all range hands grumbled, which was thoroughly and without any real intent behind it, and by 5:30 they were doing what they'd been hired to do. At 6:15, with the brake lines repaired and the wagons loaded and the sky going gray-pink at its eastern edge, Callum rode to the front of the herd. He looked back at Lenora on the seat of the lead supply wagon. She held his gaze. He nodded once. She released the brake, the real brake, the one she'd checked 3 times that morning, and the wagon rolled forward. 800 cattle moved on Callum's call like a slow brown river, and the drive that Bramwell Sutter had done everything in his power to stop rolled out of the Redford ranch yard and headed north toward Corbell Ridge in the early morning cold. The first day was brutal. Not catastrophic, just the particular brutality of a cattle drive that hit its first obstacle before the sun had cleared the ridge. The Corbell route's northern approach was rougher than the main road by a significant margin, and the cattle, who had opinions about terrain changes that they expressed freely and without subtlety, made the first 3 miles slower than Lenora's best timeline by almost 40 minutes. She noted it without alarm. She'd built contingency time into every calculation. What she hadn't built contingency for was the weather. The temperature dropped at noon in a way that wasn't the usual midday variation. It dropped with the specific abruptness that ranchers in high country learned to read as a sign, the kind of sign that made experienced men look north and go quiet. Callum rode back along the line to where she was managing the second wagon and said, without preamble, the weather's changing. How far out? Hard to say. 2 days, maybe less. He looked at the sky with the expression of someone reading something in a language they know well but don't enjoy. It's moving faster than the forecasts suggested. How much faster? We might have 1 day instead of 2 before the front hits. She did the math while he was still speaking. 1 day instead of 2 meant they needed to be through the Sawmill Creek crossing and at the first overnight camp before dark, not by early evening as planned. The second crossing would have to happen at first light tomorrow instead of mid-morning. And the third Sawmill crossing, she said. I know, he said. If the front comes in while we're at the third crossing. I know, he looked at her. What do you need? Push the pace. Not dangerously, but push it. I'll reorganize the wagon spacing so the supply teams aren't blocking the rear guard when the cattle slow at the first crossing. She looked at the wagon behind her. And I need someone on a fast horse to get ahead to the camp position and get the fires started before we arrive. The men need to eat fast and rest fast, because we're moving at 4 tomorrow, not 5. He sent a rider ahead. He pushed the pace. The cattle objected, in the way of cattle, which is to say loudly, and with physical commitment. And the drovers earned their wages over the next 4 hours, managing a herd that had decided the new route was an insult, and the new pace was a further insult, and that someone should be held accountable. Nobody was held accountable, because that was not how cattle operations worked, but a great deal of noise was generated in the attempt. Lenora drove the lead wagon and kept track of the timeline, and did not think about the weather moving in from the north, except that she was always thinking about it, because that was the kind of thing you couldn't entirely put aside. When it started to snow at 4 in the afternoon, not a blizzard, just the first light suggestion of one, fat flakes that melted when they hit the ground, she noted the time in her book and kept driving. The first Sawmill Creek crossing was exactly what the records had suggested: reliable, manageable, cold. The cattle crossed in stages, and the wagons followed, and only one wheel sank into soft bank on the far side, which Holt and two hands extracted without much ceremony. They reached the overnight camp as the light was failing. The rider Callum had sent ahead had the fires going and a basic meal underway, and the hands ate standing up because there wasn't time for the full routine. Lenora walked the picket line after eating, checking the horses, checking the wagon loads, recalculating tomorrow's pace in her head, while snow fell in the darkness around her, light and quiet and entirely uninterested in their situation. Callum found her at the second wagon checking the load straps. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine." She pulled a strap tighter. "How's the crew? Tired, holding?" He paused. "The two I was uncertain about. One of them has been working harder than anyone today. The other one." He stopped. "He disappeared for about 20 minutes this afternoon, near the first crossing." She looked up from the strap. "Was anything missing after?" "Not that Holt found." But Holt wasn't looking for anything specific. She thought about it. A man who'd been approached by Sutter's agent and hadn't said no but hadn't said yes either, watching the drive move on a different route than expected, watching the brake line sabotage fail to stop anything, deciding where he stood. "Leave him where he is for tonight," she said. If he was going to do something significant, he'd have done it at the crossing when everything was already complicated. She looked back at the strap. "Watch him tomorrow." "I'm watching all of them," Callum said. "Some more than others." The snow fell softly on the overnight camp, and the cattle were quieter in the cold, and the hands slept in their bedrolls with the specific efficiency of men who had learned to rest fast, because fast was all they were going to get. Lenora slept for 4 hours in the wagon seat, which was not comfortable, and woke at 3:30 feeling like something had disagreed with her fundamentally, and was back on her feet by 4 when Holt started moving the crew. The second sawmill crossing came at first light. It ran 20 inches. She noted this without surprise, because it was within the range she'd calculated, but 20 inches was not 14 inches, and the cattle knew it, and said so at length. The crossing took an hour and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes over her timeline, which meant the third crossing, the one she hadn't yet seen, the one she'd estimated from records, was now going to happen with the weather front, no longer a distant concern, but a close one. The sky to the north was the color of old pewter and dropping. She drove the lead wagon, and kept the pace, and looked at her notes and looked at the sky, and came to a decision she'd been approaching for the last 2 hours. She pulled the wagon up when Callum rode alongside. "Change of plan for the third crossing," she said. He looked at her. "Go on. Instead of crossing at the standard ford, we go upstream about a mile. There's a natural shelf crossing. It's in the County Survey records, from 1,871. Narrower, but the rock bottom means it doesn't run as deep regardless of water level." She pulled the folded survey page she'd brought and showed him. "I marked it before we left. I thought we might need it." He looked at the survey, then at the sky. "You thought we might need it. I think we need it now." He didn't say anything for a moment. The snow had started again, not light flakes this time, but something with more purpose to it. "How much longer to the shelf crossing than the standard ford?" he said. 1 mile upstream, 20 minutes. Against I don't know what the standard ford is running right now. With the front moving in, it could be anything. He made the decision the way he made most decisions quickly, once he'd seen the shape of the thing clearly. "Upstream," he said, and turned his horse. The shelf crossing was exactly where the 1,871 survey said it would be, which was not something Lenora had been entirely certain of, given that surveys from 1,871 had their limitations. But it was there, a wide shelf of gray stone crossing the creek at a point where the banks narrowed and the water moved faster but shallower, running over rock rather than silt. The cattle crossed in 45 minutes. The wagons crossed in 20. When the last wagon came off the far bank, the snow was coming in hard from the north. The temperature had dropped another 8 degrees. And the sky was the flat white of something that had made up its mind. Callum rode up beside the lead wagon and matched her pace. "The survey," he said. "You pulled that out of the land office 3 weeks ago. You've been carrying it the whole drive." "I've been carrying a lot of things the whole drive," she said. That seemed like a useful one. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the snow was building, and the drovers were moving the herd with the focused energy of men who could feel the weather behind them and wanted to be somewhere else before it arrived in full. "How far to the railhead?" he asked. She checked the map against her mileage estimate. 8 miles. Maybe 9 if the terrain's rougher than the survey shows. "In this weather, with this 4 hours," she said. "Maybe 5. He looked ahead at the trail, which was disappearing into white. "Then let's not stop," he said. "I wasn't planning to," she said. And they drove on into the snow, 800 cattle and 31 men, and one woman who had spent 3 weeks building contingencies for moments exactly like this one. And the mountains closed in white around them. And the weather did what weather does. It arrived without asking, and it stayed without permission, and it didn't care at all about anyone's timeline. But they were already past the worst of it. And Bramwell Sutter, sitting in his warm office in Alder Creek, watching the first heavy snow of the season come down, had no way of knowing that the drive he'd tried to stop was already through the crossing that was supposed to stop it. He would find out, just not in the way he was expecting. The railhead at Reading Flat was not a beautiful place under any circumstances, and under 6 inches of new snow, with more coming, it was something considerably less than that. It was a collection of holding pens, a weighing station, a telegraph office that worked when the weather permitted, and a low building that served as both a stockman's office and, apparently, a place where a man could get coffee so bad it felt like a personal insult. Callum got 2 cups of it anyway and brought one to Lenora without asking. She took it without thanking him, which had become, over the course of the drive, their specific shorthand for a mutual understanding that went beyond the need for ceremony. She was sitting on a crate near the weighing station with her record book open on her knee, tallying the final head count against the departure number, and she didn't look up from the page when she took the cup. 793, she said. I counted 791. Check the southeast pen. 2 broke off near the 3rd crossing, and Holt's man brought them in the back way. They were logged on the secondary sheet, not the main. He went and checked. He came back. 793, he said. Yes. He sat down on the crate beside her, not close enough to be anything particular, just close enough to be out of the wind. And they sat with their terrible coffee and looked at the holding pens where 800 head of Redford cattle, -7 lost to the crossing and weather, stood in the snow looking comprehensively unimpressed by the entire experience. We made it, he said. We made it, she agreed. Then don't say it like it was inevitable. It wasn't. It wasn't. The snow came down around them with the indifference of weather that has nothing personal against anyone. And Lenora finished her tally and closed the book and held the terrible coffee in both hands because her hands were cold. The buyer's agent arrives tomorrow morning, Callum said. If the telegraph's working, I'll send word tonight that we're here. Do that. She looked at the pens. The weights will run a little low on the rear third of the herd. They burn more in the last push than I'd calculated. You'll want to negotiate from the condition of the front group, which held well. I know how to sell cattle, Lenora. I know you do. I'm telling you the numbers so you have them. He almost smiled. What's the expected shortfall on the weight? 3 to 4% on the rear group. Negligible on the front 2/3. Still a strong sale. A very strong sale, she confirmed. Stronger than anything Sutter's interference was designed to prevent. They sat with that for a moment. When we get back, Callum said, how long until we're ready to move on the legal piece? She'd been thinking about this since the second sawmill crossing. The lawyer in Millhaven, I sent the initial letter 3 weeks ago. I need to follow up in person. I'd like to do that before news of the drive's success travels back to Alder Creek. Why before? Because right now Sutter is sitting in town thinking either we failed or we made it by the skin of our teeth, and we're too exhausted and financially stressed to pursue anything complicated. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He's not expecting us to come home with a completed drive, documented independent supply records, and a lawyer already in conversation. She looked at Callum sideways. The timing is an advantage. I don't want to lose it. He nodded. How soon after we're back? 2 days. 3 at most. I'll go with you. To Millhaven? To Millhaven. She started to say that wasn't necessary and stopped herself, because she'd learned over the past 6 weeks that the things she said weren't necessary had a way of turning out to be things that mattered for reasons she hadn't fully calculated. Fine, she said. 2 days after we're back. The buyer's agent arrived the following morning, as promised, a sharp-eyed man named Carruthers, who represented a packing operation out of Denver, and who had the practiced manner of someone who made his living finding the gap between what a seller hoped and what the market would bear. He walked the pens with Callum for an hour, making sounds that were designed to convey concern about conditions and weight, and Lenora watched from outside the pen fence and did not interfere. She let Callum negotiate. He was good at it, patient, in the same way he was patient about most things, willing to let silence work for him, not anxious about the space between offers. She'd known he would be. The thing she was watching for wasn't the negotiation itself, but Carruthers' technique. Because if she wanted to understand how buyers in this market built their pricing arguments, and she was fairly sure that what she learned in the next 2 hours was going to be useful for something she was already playing, that she hadn't mentioned to Callum yet. The final price came in 4% above what Callum had set as his minimum. Not spectacular, but solid. The weight discount on the rear group of cattle had been partially offset by a quality premium on the front group, exactly as she'd suggested. And Carruthers had eventually accepted a per-head price that reflected the overall strength of the herd rather than its weakest third. When Carruthers walked away to draft the purchase agreement, Callum came back to the fence where she was standing and said, 4% above floor. I heard. Good outcome. Yes, she looked at him. The rear group should recover weight quickly if they're well fed for 2 weeks. You might want to put that in writing with the packing operation. It affects processing timing, and you want that factored into the agreement. He stared at her. How do you know about packing operation timelines? I read, she said simply, while you were sleeping on the drive. The stockman's office had 3 years of industry bulletins. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, I'll add it to the purchase agreement. Good. They rode back toward Alder Creek 2 days later, the full crew minus Mortkale's freight teams which had already turned south, and the drive that Bramwell Sutter had tried to stop by cutting brake lines and pulling contracted drovers arrived back in home county, with every supply wagon intact, every record in order, and Lenjora's accounting book containing a complete documented record of every independent purchase, every farmer invoice, every freight receipt, and every departure from Sutter's controlled supply network. She'd been keeping that record since the first day of planning. She had not mentioned to Callum how thorough it was. She was mentioning it now, on the road back, because there were things he needed to understand before they walked into a lawyer's office. This isn't just evidence of what Sutter was charging, she said. It's evidence of what's possible without him. We have 3 years of his prices and 6 weeks of independent prices side by side. Any reasonable person looking at those numbers can see exactly what the difference is and who it benefited. Callum rode beside her, listening, and the farmers Bertha Olson, Josiah Hicks, the others they can testify to what they were actually paid versus what the invoices reaching your account showed. That's not price gouging. That's falsification of documents. That's a crime, he said. That is a crime, she confirmed. The lawyer is going to want the original invoices, not copies. You have them? In the ranch safe. Good. Bring everything. Let him decide what's useful and what isn't. She adjusted her grip on the reins. There's one more thing I haven't told you. He looked at her. The hand you were watching. On the drive. The one who disappeared for 20 minutes near the first crossing. Jessup, Callum said. His voice had gone flat. I spoke to him the night of the second camp, while you were going over the route with Holt. A pause. You spoke to him. I did. Lenore, he hadn't committed to anything, she said. Dooley had approached him, offered him double wages to report on the route and timing. He'd taken the initial conversation, but hadn't taken money and hadn't provided information. He was uncomfortable. She chose the word carefully. He's been with your ranch for 7 years. He didn't want to be in the position Dooley had put him in. What did you say to him? I told him that the way out of the position was to tell me exactly what Dooley had asked for and when, and that if he did that and didn't communicate anything further, his 7 years with the ranch would stay intact. The road was quiet around them, snow on the fields. The tired, rhythmic sound of horses and cattle moving at end-of-drive pace. You made him that offer without asking me, Callum said. Yes. She didn't apologize for it, because you would have wanted to fire him on the spot, and that would have warned Sutter that we'd identified a contact, and we needed that information more than we needed the satisfaction of letting him go. A longer silence. What did Dooley ask for? Callum said finally. The supply route, the camp positions, whether you had documentation on board, She looked at Callum directly. He wanted to know about the paperwork. That confirms what I suspected. Sutter isn't just trying to disrupt the drive. He wants the documentation. He knows something is being built against him. How does he know? I'm not certain. Could be Cordelia Varn reported more than gossip from the mercantile. Could be that someone in the land office or the postal system noticed patterns. She paused. Could be he's simply been running schemes long enough to recognize the signs of someone looking at his accounts. It doesn't matter how he knows. What matters is that he's actively trying to find and destroy the paper trail. Callum's jaw tightened. And Jessup gave me everything Dooley asked for, and nothing after. She held his gaze. He also told me that Dooley specifically asked whether a woman was involved in the accounting. By name. The tightening in Callum's jaw went somewhere deeper. He asked about you by name. He asked about a widow Redford had hired. He didn't have my name, but yes, she kept her voice even. That's why the lawyer visit happens in 2 days, not 3. We need to be ahead of whatever Sutter is planning next. They reached the Redford ranch by late afternoon. The crew dispersed to the bunkhouse with the specific gratitude of men who had slept on cold ground for 6 days and were ready to stop doing that. Holt took the final livestock count and the wagon inventory and thanked her in a way that was brief and entirely sincere, which she appreciated more than effusiveness would have been. Callum walked her to her horse when she was ready to ride home. 2 days, he said. I'll be here at first light. He nodded, then Lenora. He stopped, started again. What you did on this drive, the route change, the crossing survey, the camp positions, all of it. He looked at her with an expression that was working through several things at once and arriving somewhere honest. I wouldn't have made it without the supply operation you built. The drive would have failed. She looked at him for a moment. The drive was well run on every end, she said. You moved 800 cattle through a closing mountain pass in early blizzard conditions with a short crew. Don't underestimate what that is. I'm not underestimating anything, he said. He stopped again. I'm saying it out loud. Because it's true, and I want you to hear it said plainly. She was quiet for a moment. I hear it, she said. And then, because she was who she was, thank you. She rode home to Whitfield Hollow in the early dark and found Elsie asleep at the kitchen table over her reader, which the girl had apparently been doing for some time based on the state of the lamp. Lenora lifted her without waking her and carried her to bed and stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the particular tiredness of someone who has been running on calculation and purpose for 6 straight days and has only just stopped moving. She went back to the kitchen and sat at the table and opened the account book and looked at the numbers, the drive numbers, the supply costs, the margins, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, which was something close to relief. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it somewhere ahead. She closed the book and went to bed. Millhaven was a larger town than Alder Creek, which wasn't difficult to be, but it had the specific energy of a place that considered itself a regional center and acted accordingly. The lawyer's office was above a dry goods store on the main street, a clean, organized space that smelled of paper and wood polish, and the particular serious atmosphere of a place where consequential things were decided. His name was Roland Fitch. He was 50, with a careful manner and the listening quality of someone who had learned that clients told you more if you let them finish. He'd received Lenora's letter and had done some preliminary work already, which she discovered when he opened a folder on his desk that contained notes she hadn't sent him. You've been researching independently, she said. Your letter raised questions about supply brokerage practices in this county, Fitch said. I had some existing familiarity with the regulatory framework around freight and commodity brokerage in the territory. I was curious. What did you find? He looked at her over his reading glasses. That the practices you described, if documented as you suggested, would constitute multiple violations of territory commerce statutes, specifically the falsification of commercial invoices and the restraint of trade through coordinated merchant agreements. He looked at Callum. Mr. Redford, you've been a victim of a systematic fraud for based on what misses. Whitfield described at least 6 years, possibly longer. Callum's face didn't change much. Can it be prosecuted? That depends on the documentation. He turned back to Lenora. You said you have original invoices. She opened her bag and placed the leather-strapped file on his desk. 3 years of Redford Ranch supply invoices, 6 weeks of independent purchase records, farmer testimonials she'd written out in longhand with dates and names. The documented difference between Sutter's prices and the actual market prices. The notes she'd kept on Sutter's visit to the ranch, on Cordelia Varn's mercantile conversation, on Dooley's approaches to the drovers. Fitch looked through the file for 15 minutes without speaking. When he looked up, his expression had changed from careful to something more direct. Mrs. Whitfield, did you compile all of this yourself? Yes. With Mr. Redford's knowledge and cooperation? Yes, Callum said. Fitch looked between them. This is stopped. Restarted. This is exceptionally thorough documentation for a private individual without legal training. I had a farm to run for 10 years, she said. Accounts are accounts. He looked at the farmer testimonials. These individuals, Olson, Hicks, they're willing to speak formally? Yes. Bertha Olson's signed statement is in the back of the file. Josiah Hicks said he'd come in person if needed. Fitch turned more pages. The drover interference. This is harder to connect directly to Sutter without testimony from the men who withdrew. I know. She'd thought about this. But you have the letter language, the identical phrasing across 3 separate letters to 3 separate ranchers. That's not coincidence. And I have the testimony from a ranch hand who was approached directly by Sutter's agent. She'd written Jessup's account out the previous evening, dated and specific. She pulled it from her bag and placed it separately on the desk. He's willing to speak to it. Fitch read the statement. He set it down carefully. You've been building this for how long? He asked. About 8 weeks, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. There are territorial marshals who take years to build cases this well organized. She didn't say anything to that. Callum said, what happens next? Fitch closed the file. I file a formal complaint with the Territorial Commerce Authority. Given the documentation, they'll open an investigation. They'll want to bring in their own auditors to verify the numbers, which is standard process, and your documentation will make their work significantly faster. Simultaneously, we put the merchant agreements under legal review. If Sutter's arrangement with Hartley, the feed store, and the freight company is what this evidence suggests, those agreements are void under territory law. How long? Callum asked. For the investigation to open formally. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. For the full process, Fitch leaned back. These things move at their own pace. I won't promise you a timeline. What I will tell you is that with documentation this complete, Sutter has very little room to maneuver. His defense will rely on calling the accounting into question, and the accounting, he gestured at the file, is not easy to call into question. He'll know the complaint has been filed, Lenora said. Yes, there's no confidential filing process for commerce violations. When he knows, he'll try to move money and destroy records. We can request a preservation order on his commercial records as part of the filing. That freezes his ability to alter documents from the date of the order. Fitch looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, something adjacent to impressed. You've thought about this. At length, she said. They spent another 2 hours with Fitch, going through the documentation in detail, organizing the formal complaint, and discussing the parallel legal actions available to Macon Pruett and Ida Fenwick, who had agreed through Callum to participate in the county-wide case. By the time they left the lawyer's office, the afternoon light was fading, and the street below was cold and quiet. They rode the first mile back toward Alder Creek without speaking. Then Callum said, Pruett is going to want to be in the room when the complaint goes public. He should be, Lenora said. The more ranchers visible in the complaint, the harder it is to frame it as a personal dispute between you and Sutter. He's going to say it's personal anyway. Yes. She adjusted her coat against the cold. He's going to say, I'm a widow with a grudge, and that you're a wealthy rancher with a personal vendetta, and that the whole thing is manufactured. She said it without particular emotion, because she'd thought through this as thoroughly as she'd thought through the sawmill crossing. He'll say it loudly, and he'll say it to anyone who'll listen, and some people will believe him. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. Some. But what people believe before evidence is presented isn't the same as what they believe after. She looked at the road ahead. The numbers don't lie. Fitch knows it. The Commerce Authority's auditors will know it. Eventually the town will know it. Eventually is a long time to have people talking about you. Mr. Redford, she said, with the particular dryness she'd developed for specific moments. People have been talking about me since Thomas died. I have not yet dissolved. The quiet that followed had something in it that might, in different circumstances, have been a laugh. It took 9 days, not 2 or 3. Fitch filed the formal complaint on a Tuesday. The preservation order, on Sutter's commercial records was granted the following Thursday. The Territorial Commerce Authority sent a letter confirming the opening of a formal investigation the Tuesday after that, which was when word reached Alder Creek, in the way word always reached small towns, not through official channels, but through the person who knew the person who'd been in Millhaven when the filing happened, and had mentioned it to someone at the post office. By the end of that Tuesday, Lenora could tell the town knew from the way Emmett Hartley looked at her when she came into the mercantile. He didn't say anything. He filled her order without the slight delays and the careful neutrality that had characterized his behavior for the past 2 months, and when he counted out her change, he was scrupulously exact about it, and met her eyes when he handed it over. It wasn't an apology. It was the mercantile version of an adjustment, the way people in small towns recalibrate their behavior when the social arithmetic changes. She noted it without comment and went home. Sutter's response came 2 days later, and it was exactly what she'd told Fitch it would be. He called a meeting. Not an official one. Sutter was too careful for anything that would generate a formal record at this stage, but the kind of meeting that happened at the feed store on a Wednesday afternoon, when certain. Men in the county knew to show up, and others didn't. Callum knew about it because Macon Pruett sent word, and Pruett knew about it because Sutter had made the mistake of inviting him, apparently under the impression that Pruett was still a neutral party. Pruett was not a neutral party. He came to the meeting and sat in the back and listened to Sutter spend 45 minutes explaining, in the careful language of a man who knew a lawyer had seen the documents, that the complaint against him was the result of a personal dispute between Callum Redford and himself, that the widow Whitfield had been manipulating a grieving, he used that word, grieving. Though Thomas Whitfield had been dead for 18 months, a grieving rancher for her own financial advantage, and that the numbers being presented as evidence were the selective work of an untrained woman with a particular agenda. Sutter was good at it. He had 20 years of social capital in that room, and he spent it carefully, not panicking, not overreaching, just repositioning with the patience of a man who'd survived difficult seasons before. Pruett listened to the whole thing and then said, from the back of the room, Bramwell, I've seen the invoices. The room went quiet. Sutter looked at him, Macon. I've seen my own invoices against the farmer prices. Not Redford's, mine. Pruett's voice was entirely flat. You've been charging me 40% above market on winter feed for at least 5 years. I've checked my own records now. 5 years. He stood up. So I'd appreciate it if you didn't spend too much more time in this room talking about personal disputes and agenda. Because what you've got here is a room full of men you've been robbing, and some of us have just now figured that out. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously realize that a conversation they thought was about someone else is actually about them. Sutter recovered. She had to concede. Impressive in a crisis, his expression didn't collapse, his voice didn't crack. He said something measured about the difference between brokerage fees and fraud, and the importance of understanding commercial arrangements before making accusations in public. But Pruett had already said what he'd said, and the room had already heard it. Pruett reported the meeting to Callum that evening, and Callum told Lenora the next morning. She listened to the whole account, and then said, "Good." "Good?" Callum repeated. He showed his hand. He's going to fight the personal dispute angle because it's the only one he has, which means he's not going to produce a credible alternative accounting of where the money went, because he can't. She looked at the notes she'd been keeping on the meeting. The men in that room, some of them are going to go home and look at their own invoices. Same way Pruett did. And when they do, they're going to find the same thing Pruett found. She set her pencil down. The case just got larger than Sutter expected. He walked into that meeting, thinking he could contain it to a dispute between two men. He walked out with a room full of ranchers who are now asking questions about their own accounts. Callum was quiet for a moment. "Ida Fenwick's going to Millhaven this week," he said. She called the invoice meeting herself, apparently. 6 ranchers from the river bottom. I know. Fitch wrote me. Lenora looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at Whitfield Hollow in the thin winter light. When Fitch presents the full documentation to the Commerce Authority auditors next month, it's not going to look like one man's complaint. It's going to look like a county-wide pattern of fraud. That's a different scale of consequence for Sutter. Different how? The difference between a fine and a criminal proceeding, she said simply. Callum looked at her for a long moment. You planned for that too. I hoped for it, she said. There's a difference. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in that neighborhood. The Commerce Authority auditors arrived in Alder Creek 3 weeks later, 2 men from the territorial capital who wore identical coats and carried identical bags and spoke to each other in a shorthand that suggested they'd been doing this for a long time. They set up in the back room of the Territorial Land Office, which was the only space in Alder Creek with a large enough table and enough neutrality to serve, and they began working through Sutter's commercial records. Lenora was not in that room. She was not a party to the official proceedings and had no standing to be present, which was a frustration she managed by reminding herself that the reason she wasn't in the room was that she'd done her job well enough, that other people could do their job now. She heard about the progress through Fitch, who sent brief letters every few days. The auditors had confirmed the invoice discrepancies in the first week. They'd identified 3 additional ranchers beyond the original complaint whose accounts showed identical patterns, which expanded the formal complaint significantly. In the 3rd week, they requested Lenora's original documentation, the 3 years of Redford Ranch invoices, the farmer testimonials, the supply records from the drive. She sent it all. Sutter, through his own lawyer, filed a counterargument that characterized Lenora's accounting as amateur and selective. The counter-argument did not produce alternative numbers. It produced language about methodology and the limitations of informal record-keeping and the inherent unreliability of second-hand farmer testimony. Fitch wrote her that the auditors had read the counter-argument and returned to her documentation. Then he wrote that the auditors had completed their work. Then he wrote, "The Territorial Commerce Authority has found sufficient cause to refer the matter to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for formal criminal proceeding. The preservation order on Mr. Sutter's commercial records has been extended. I believe you should come to Millhaven at your earliest convenience." She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, folded it, put it in the drawer where she kept the documents that mattered. Then she went and found Elsie in the side yard, throwing scraps to the chickens, and said, "Come inside for a minute." Elsie came in and stood at the kitchen table with a chicken feather caught in her hair. "Do you remember the day in the mercantile?" Lenora said. "A few months ago." Elsie looked at her steadily, the blue calico day. "Yes." Lenora sat down at the table. "Do you know why that day mattered?" Elsie thought about it. "Because of what Mrs. Varnes said." "Partly. But the bigger thing wasn't what she said." Lenora folded her hands on the table, the same way she folded them when she was working through numbers. "The bigger thing was what happened after. Because of that day, I took a job. Because of that job, I saw something that wasn't right. And because I saw it and wrote it down instead of looking away," she stopped. "A lot of people who were being cheated are going to get something like justice. Not perfect, not everything they lost, but something." Elsie looked at her with the 9-year-old's particular seriousness. "Did you fix it?" "We fixed it," Lenora said. "Redford and the other ranchers and the farmers and a lawyer and me." She looked at her daughter. "That's how things actually get fixed. Not by one person. By enough people looking at the same problem and deciding it's worth the trouble." Elsie nodded slowly. Then she reached up and pulled the chicken feather from her hair and looked at it. "Is Mr. Redford coming to supper tonight?" Lenora blinked. "What? He came Tuesday and last Friday. I thought maybe." "He does not come to supper," Lenora said. "He ate the stew," Elsie said, with the particular precision of a child making a factual point. "He was here for a meeting, and the meeting ran late, and I offered him a bowl of stew, because it would have been rude not to." She stood up. "Go finish with the chickens." Elsie went with the chicken feather and the serene expression of someone who has made their point and is content to let it sit. Lenora stood at the kitchen table for a moment longer. The letter was in the drawer. 3 years of invoices had become a criminal proceeding. A widow with 63 cents in a teacup had, over the course of 4 months, helped build a case that would dismantle the financial architecture of the most powerful broker in the county. She thought about the stew, about Tuesday and last Friday. She thought about the accounting books. Callum had dropped on his kitchen table the first afternoon, and the way he'd said, "Take whatever you need without hesitation," and the particular quality of his silence on the ride back from Cooper's Crossing, and standing beside the wagons in the pre-dawn dark with the brake lines cut, and both of them deciding, without discussion, that the answer was still forward. She went and put more water on for supper. She did not examine the reason she put out 2 bowls. Callum did come to supper that Friday. He didn't announce it. He rode up around 5 in the evening with a paper-wrap package from the butcher in Alder Creek pork chops. which was either a coincidence or an awareness that Lenora's meat supply had been running thin, and she chose not to examine which and stood on the porch and said, "I had business in town. Thought I'd stop." "You thought you'd stop," she repeated. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open, because there was no graceful way to send a man home when he was standing on your porch with pork chops and an entirely straight face. Elsie appeared from the kitchen, saw Callum, and said, "I knew it," with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions have once again been confirmed by events, and retreated before Lenora could respond. They ate supper at the kitchen table, pork chops and potatoes, and the last of the winter squash, and the conversation was, on the surface, about the Millhaven proceedings and what Fitch had written and what would happen next. But underneath the practical content there was something else moving, quieter and slower, the way a current moves under ice. Lenora was aware of it. She thought Callum was aware of it. Neither of them addressed it directly, which was, she suspected, the right instinct, because some things named too early became awkward and brittle, and some things left unnamed a little longer developed their own natural structure. After supper, Callum helped clear the table, which he did without asking and without making a ceremony of it, and Elsie went to bed without the usual negotiation about how much longer she could stay up, which Lenora suspected was a form of tactical withdrawal on the child's part. They sat on the porch for a while in the cold, not close, just on the same porch. "Fitch thinks the criminal proceeding could take 6 months, Callum said. Maybe more." "I know. And Sutter will fight every step." "Yes, that's his right." She looked out at the dark yard. "But the preservation order means he can't destroy anything, and the auditors have already confirmed the discrepancies in their official report. The argument from here is over what to call it and what the consequences are. The facts are established. Some people will still believe him. Some people believed the world was flat for a considerable time after it was demonstrated otherwise," she said. "People believe what they want to believe. You can't account for that in the legal strategy. You just make the evidence strong enough that neutrality becomes difficult." Callum was quiet for a moment. "He's already started repositioning socially. I heard he's been suggesting to certain people that the whole complaint was engineered by outside interests trying to destabilize local commerce." "Outside interests," she said. "You, presumably." "I've lived 14 miles from Alder Creek for 10 years, she said. "My husband is buried on this property." "I know that. The argument doesn't need to make sense," she said. "It just needs to give people who are already inclined toward him a reason to maintain that inclination." She pulled her coat tighter. "It won't hold. Not when the ranchers in that feed store meeting went home and ran their own numbers. There are too many of them, and the numbers are too clear." She was right about that, as it turned out, though right didn't mean fast. The 6 months Fitch had predicted stretched to 8, which was the nature of territorial legal proceedings when one party had resources and a practiced lawyer and no particular reason to cooperate with speed. Sutter's attorney filed motions and counterfilings and requests for documentation review that pushed the timeline forward in small increments that were individually reasonable and collectively exhausting. Lenora tracked all of it. She kept a separate file just for the proceedings, dated and organized, and she read every document Fitch sent her and wrote back with questions when she had them, which was regularly. Fitch, to his credit, answered her questions with the same directness she'd have wanted from anyone she was working with. He'd said once, in a letter midway through the proceedings, that he wished she'd gone to law school, and she'd written back that she'd had a farm to run and a daughter to raise, and that the law would have had to wait regardless. The life during those 8 months was, in its externals, not so different from the life before. She sewed. She managed accounts. She kept Whitfield Hollow running with the particular efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste anything time, money, material, effort. The difference was the cooperative. It had started almost by accident with Bertha Olson. After Bertha's testimony to the Commerce Authority auditors, 2 other women, both wives of smaller ranchers who'd been in the expanded complaint, had reached out to Bertha, asking how Cad gotten a fair price for her grain without going through Sutter's network. Bertha had told them about Lenora's independent supply arrangements during the drive. They'd asked if something similar could work on a permanent basis. Bertha had written to Lenora. Lenora had thought about it for a week and then written back with a proposal. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple, a purchasing cooperative through which smaller farms and ranches could could buy directly from independent producers without a broker's markup, using collective volume to negotiate better prices than any individual operation could manage alone. The legal structure was straightforward. Fitch helped her draft it in 2 evenings, and the initial membership was 7 operations, including Bertha Olson, Josiah Hicks, and 2 of the ranchers from the river bottom who joined Ida Fenwick's complaint. By the following spring, it was 14 operations. By fall, it was 23. Sutter's network, deprived of the major rancher accounts and now under active investigation, had begun to fray from the edges. Emmett Hartley at the Mercantile renegotiated his supplier agreements independently, which was something he apparently should have done years earlier and had not, for reasons that Lenora suspected involved more than simple inertia. The feed store changed hands. The owner sold to his nephew, who had no existing relationship with Sutter's brokerage and no interest in developing one. The freight company signed directly with 3 major ranch operations, rather than routing through a broker. None of this was clean. None of it happened without difficulty and friction, and the occasional conversation that ended badly. The cooperative had 2 members who disagreed strongly about the payment schedule, and one who didn't understand why cooperative decisions required group agreement rather than individual judgment. And these were the kinds of problems that didn't resolve themselves in a single conversation and required the patience of someone who understood that imperfect progress was still progress. Lenora had that patience. She'd learned it from accounts from years of understanding that the number at the bottom of the column was rarely the number you wanted, and that the question was always what you did from there. The formal proceeding concluded on a gray October morning in the territorial courthouse in Millhaven. Lenora was there. Callum was there. Macon Pruett was there, uncomfortable in a good coat and a tie he'd clearly tied incorrectly and refused to have corrected. Ida Fenwick was there in a dress the color of storm clouds, with the specific contained energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for this specific day. Bertha Olson was there because Lenora had asked her. Sutter was there with his lawyer, who was good and with the particular careful composure of a man who knew the outcome and was managing how he inhabited it. He was 63 now, and the 8 months had done something to him that Lenora noted without satisfaction, not triumph, just observation. The silver-haired certainty that had walked into Callum's ranch yard with a handshake and a business card had been replaced by something more careful and more tired. The territorial judge was a woman named Hargreaves, who had come to the bench from a background in commercial law and who read the ruling from prepared notes in a tone that was entirely without drama, which was either a mercy or an additional punishment, depending on where you were sitting. The ruling found Bramwell Sutter guilty on 4 counts of commercial fraud, 1 count of deliberate falsification of commercial documents, and 1 count of illegal restraint of trade. The financial penalty was substantial, not everything the ranchers had lost over 6 or more years, which was a practical impossibility given the complexity of untangling that accounting, but a documented portion of it, distributed among the complainants according to a formula the auditors had constructed. Sutter's commercial license was revoked. His ability to operate as a broker in the territory was permanently suspended. The merchant agreements he'd maintained were voided in their entirety. His lawyer requested a statement period. Judge Hargreaves allowed it. Sutter stood up and said, in a voice that was controlled and showed the work it cost, that he disagreed with the finding, that he intended to appeal through available channels, and that the proceeding had been influenced by parties with personal interests that went beyond legitimate legal complaint. He looked at Lenora when he said this last part. She looked back at him steadily. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Judge Hargreaves noted the statement for the record, dismissed the proceeding, and the courtroom moved through the specific organized noise of people who have been sitting still for a long time, finally being allowed to stop. Pruett shook Callum's hand. Ida Fenwick said something short and direct that might have been thank you, or might have been something stronger. It was hard to tell with Ida. Bertha Olson found Lenora near the back of the courtroom and said simply, "Well, there it is." "There it is," Lenora agreed. "You feel like you thought you would." Lenora considered this honestly. She'd expected something larger from this moment, some version of release or resolution that felt proportional to 8 months of work and years of watching a man like Sutter go unchallenged. What she felt instead was quieter and more complicated. Something like the way a house feels after a long illness has finally passed, not festive, just stiller. A little more room to breathe. "Not quite," she said, "but close enough. Bertha nodded as if this was exactly the right answer. Never is quite. Is it? No, Lenora said, never is quite. Callum didn't propose on the way home from Millhaven. He didn't propose for another 3 months. And when he did, it was at the kitchen table at Whitfield Hollow on a January evening, over the account books for the cooperative, which was not a romantic setting and was also, Lenora thought afterward, exactly the right setting. It meant he understood what he was asking. He wasn't asking her to step away from anything. He was asking in the middle of it. He slid the cooperative's account ledger toward her and said, "I'd like to discuss a permanent arrangement." She looked at the ledger, then at him. What kind of permanent arrangement? The kind that involves a legal document. She waited. Marriage, he said, if you're willing. She was quiet for a moment. You're proposing at the account books. The account books are where most of our important conversations happen, he said. It seemed consistent. That's not romantic. No, he agreed. Is that a requirement? She looked at him for a long moment. At the particular quality of his attention, the steadiness of it, the way it never performed anything, the way he waited without pressure. She thought about Thomas, who had been a different kind of man, a good man, who had loved her and left her with debt and a daughter and 63 cents in a teacup, and who she had loved back without conditions, and who was in the ground on the property she'd kept running through sheer arithmetic and stubbornness for 18 months before any of this began. She thought about what it meant to be someone who remarried, the way the town would read it, the way Elsie would read it, the way she herself would read it in the quiet hours. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. Whitfield Hollow stays in my name. Yes, he said without hesitation. The cooperative stays independent of the ranch operations. I run it separately, and I run it my way. Yes. And if we disagree about something consequential, the ranch, the cooperative, anything, we negotiate it, the same way we've been negotiating everything for the past year. Meaning, you make a thorough argument with documented evidence, and I consider it seriously. Meaning neither of us acts unilaterally, she said, the way it says in your agreement. Something moved in his expression, the almost smile she'd cataloged, the one that lived near the edge of his face, and never quite committed. You still have the agreement. I still have everything, she said. I told you. I write things down. He looked at her. Is that a yes? She looked back at him. At the account books between them, at the lamp burning on the table, at the kitchen of Whitfield Hollow, with its particular history of her sitting at this table, and counting and recounting and finding a way through whatever the column produced. Yes, she said. That's a yes. He didn't reach across the table and take her hand. He just nodded, the way he nodded when something was settled and real and didn't require performance. She appreciated this more than she could have explained. From the hallway, clearly having been standing there for some undetermined amount of time, Elsie said finally in the tone of a person whose patience has been considerably tested. Go to bed, Lenora said. I'm going, Elsie said, and the sound of small feet retreated without any particular urgency. They married in March, in the front room of Whitfield Hollow, with Fitch as a witness and Bertha Olson as the other, and Elsie standing between them in the blue-flowered dress. Not the original one that one had been made when Elsie was 9 and she was 10 now, and had grown 2 inches over the winter, with the particular inconsiderateness of children who grow when you're not watching. Lenora had made a new one from the remaining calico, which had been sitting folded in the cedar chest since the first dress was finished, and the new dress had a sash and proper buttons, and enough room in the hem for another inch before it would need letting out. Elsie wore it like she'd been born to it, which Lenora thought she had. The ceremony was short. The judge who came out from Alder Creek was a practical man who said the words without embellishment, and seemed to appreciate that neither party wanted embellishment. Callum said what he needed to say. Lenora said what she needed to say. The ring was plain gold, which she'd asked for specifically, and it fit. Bertha Olson cried, which surprised everyone, including Bertha. Afterward, they ate at the table, and Callum and Fitch talked about the appeal Sutter's lawyer had filed. It was pending, and would likely fail. But Fitch wanted them to understand what was involved, and Bertha and Lenora talked about the spring supply schedule for the cooperative, and Elsie ate 2 pieces of pie and said nothing, but watched everything with the serious attention she'd developed lately, which Lenora suspected was going to serve her well in whatever life she ended up building. It was not a perfect day. The stove smoked in the afternoon, and they had to open 2 windows despite the cold, and the second layer of the cake had come out denser than intended. Fitch got a splinter from the porch rail, and spent considerable time dealing with it. The judge's horse bit one of Callum's hired hands on the way out, which required an apology and a brief discussion. It was the kind of day that happened in real life, rather than in the version of life that people describe afterward. Lenora thought it was exactly right. The following Saturday, Elsie asked if she could go to the mercantile alone. Lenora looked up from the cooperative accounts she was reviewing. Alone? I have my own money, Elsie said, from helping with the supply books. You said I could have a portion. This was true. Lenora had started paying Elsie a small wage for her work on the cooperative records 3 months ago, partly because the work was genuinely useful, and partly because she believed very firmly that a girl should learn early that her labor had value and should be paid for. What do you need? Lenora asked. A ribbon, Elsie said, from the notions counter. Lenora looked at her for a moment. All right, straight there and straight back. Yes, Mama. She watched Elsie go down the lane in the blue-flowered dress, in the March morning that was cold, but with the particular quality of cold that means winter is considering leaving. She stood at the kitchen door until Elsie was out of sight and then went back to the accounts. Callum was at the ranch that morning. He came by around midday to go over the spring supply arrangements, and when he arrived, Elsie wasn't back yet, which was not alarming the walk to town, and back was nearly 3 miles, but which Lenora noted. They were going over the spring numbers when they heard Elsie's feet on the porch steps. The girl came in with her ribbon blue to match the dress, which Lenora suspected was not a coincidence, and a slightly bright-eyed expression that meant something had happened, and she was deciding how to report it. How was town? Lenora asked. Fine. Elsie sat down at the table and put her ribbon on it. Fine how? A pause. Mrs. Varn was at the mercantile. The kitchen went quiet in a particular way. Lenora set her pencil down. And, she said. Elsie smoothed the ribbon on the table. There was a little girl there, with her grandmother. They didn't have enough money for the cloth they were looking at. The grandmother was counting, and she kept coming up short, and the little girl kept saying it was fine, it didn't matter. Elsie looked at the ribbon. She sounded like me, she said simply. From before. Lenora looked at her daughter. So I bought the ribbon, Elsie continued, and then I had some pennies left, and I gave them to the grandmother for the cloth. She looked up. Was that wrong? No, Lenora said. That wasn't wrong. Mrs. Varn saw me do it, Elsie said. She didn't say anything. No, Lenora agreed. I don't expect she did. Elsie nodded, satisfied, and picked up the ribbon. I'm going to braid it in tonight, she said, and went to her room. Callum, who had been entirely still through this exchange, looked at Lenora. She looked back at him. There wasn't anything that needed saying. The cooperative had 31 member operations by the end of that first spring. Lenora hired a woman named Martha Graves to handle the day-to-day correspondence. Martha was the widow of a farmer who'd been in the original complaint, capable and detail-oriented, and badly in need of steady work. She hired a second woman, Nella Parks, the following fall to manage the freight coordination because the cooperative's volume had grown to the point where freight was its own full problem. She kept the deed to Whitfield Hollow in the cedar chest under the remaining calico. She'd thought about framing it once and decided against it. It wasn't a trophy. It was a document. The thing it represented didn't need display. What she did put on the wall of the small office she'd built in the back room of Whitfield Hollow, the office that had replaced the storage that had never been organized anyway, was a simple piece of paper in a plain wood frame. Not a certificate or a legal document. Just a list of numbers, handwritten, dated from the morning she'd sat at the kitchen table before dawn, with the lamp turned low and the 63 cents counted out in the cracked blue teacup. Flour almost gone, lamp oil, quarter bottle, coins 63 cents. She kept it there because she thought it was important to remember what the starting point had been. Not because she was proud of the difficulty she wasn't, particularly, and she had no patience for the idea that suffering was ennobling in itself because she'd watched enough people suffer without it producing anything except more suffering. But because the distance between 63 cents and what she'd built from it was a useful piece of information. It told her something true about what was possible from a position that looked like nothing. It also reminded her, on the days when the cooperative had problems that resisted solution, and the accounts didn't balance, and Martha Graves was frustrated, and Nella Parks had a conflict with a supplier, and Callum was being stubborn about something she was right about, which happened, because he was not a perfect man, and she was not a perfect woman, and that was entirely fine. It reminded her that she had solved harder problems from worse positions. The teacup itself still sat on the shelf in the kitchen. She still didn't use it for tea. Sutter's appeal was denied the following November. His attorney filed a secondary appeal on narrower grounds, which took another 4 months, and was also denied. After that, there was nothing left to file. And the case that Lenora had started building on the morning she first opened Callum's invoice files at the kitchen table in the Redford ranch was finally, formally, completely closed. Sutter left Alder Creek sometime that winter. Not dramatically, he didn't announce it or make a scene about it. He was simply there 1 week and not there the following week, and his house on the good side of town was quietly listed for sale, and by the spring he was gone. Lenora heard through the cooperative's network that he'd gone north, toward the Montana territories, which was where men sometimes went when a place had finished with them. She thought about him occasionally, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, just with the particular clarity of someone who has looked very closely at a thing and understands how it worked. Sutter had not been a monster. He'd been a man who'd found a gap in how trust operated in a small community and had decided, very practically, to use it. He'd been protected for years by the assumptions that no one would look carefully at the numbers, and that assumption had held until it didn't, and then everything had followed from there. The gap he'd found still existed, which was the thing that Lenora thought about more than she thought about Sutter himself. It existed everywhere people trusted without verifying, everywhere one person controlled information that many people depended on and no one compared notes. The cooperative was one answer to that gap, not a perfect answer, because there was no perfect answer, but a structural answer, a way of organizing things so that the information lived with more than one person, and the verification happened as a matter of routine rather than crisis. She'd started writing some of this down. Not for publication, she wasn't sure what she thought about publication, but because she'd found that working through ideas on paper was how she understood them, and she wanted to understand this one fully. How markets broke, how trust was exploited, what structural arrangements made exploitation harder. She wasn't sure what the writing would become. She wasn't in a hurry to decide. Callum found her at it one evening and read over her shoulder for a minute and said, "You should send this to someone." Who? Someone who deals with commerce regulation. The territorial authority, maybe, or one of the agricultural colleges. I'm a seamstress. You're a woman who built a legal case that took down a 6-year fraud and then founded a supply cooperative with 31 member operations, he said. The seamstress part is also true, but it's not the complete picture. She looked up at him. "Are you trying to tell me what to do?" "No," he said, stepping back with the calm of someone who had learned when to retreat and was not embarrassed by the learning. "I'm suggesting." "You can discard the suggestion." She looked at the papers for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said, which was true and which meant approximately what it meant when she said it about anything that she would think about it thoroughly and reach her own conclusion. He nodded and went back to what he'd been doing. She looked at the papers for a while longer. Then she picked up her pencil and kept writing. The thing about building something from 63 cents is that it doesn't teach you that hard work always wins, or that good people are always rewarded, or that the world is fair if you are patient enough with it. Lenora had watched enough of life to know that none of those things were reliably true, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. What it taught her, the specific thing, the one she turned over in the back of her mind on ordinary days, on days when nothing was at stake, and the accounts were balanced, and Elsie was doing her lessons at the table, and Callum was out with the cattle, and Martha Graves was handling the cooperative correspondence without. Needing her was something smaller and more durable. It taught her that being underestimated was a position, not a verdict. That being invisible in a room was information about the room's assumptions, not about your presence. That the people most dangerous to a dishonest system were not the ones who shouted about it, but the ones who wrote things down quietly and kept asking what the numbers actually said. And that a single moment of someone else's cruelty, a laugh in a mercantile, directed at a child in a patched brown undress could become, if you refuse to let it make you smaller, the first movement of something that eventually reached further than anyone in that room could have imagined. Elsie turned 11 that spring. She was already better at mental arithmetic than most adults Lenora knew, and she'd started keeping her own small notebook of observations about the cooperative operations, written in the careful hand of someone who'd been told that what she noticed mattered and had decided to take that seriously. She still had the blue dress. She'd need a new one by fall. On a Saturday morning in May, Lenora watched from the kitchen window as Elsie walked down the lane toward Alder Creek in the dress, the blue ribbon in her braid, carrying her own small purse with her own earned money, and thought about the first morning she'd watched Elsie approach the calico bolt with her hand raised and not touching. The distance between those two mornings was not a story about triumph. It was a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the position they've been assigned. Not dramatically, no speeches, no declarations, but practically, in the particular stubborn daily way of someone who keeps adding the columns and asking what the numbers actually say, and writing things down and refusing to look away from what the writing shows. It was a story about 30 yards of calico that became a dress, that became a job, that became an accounting file, that became a legal case, that became a cooperative, that fed and clothed and fairly priced the work of 31 operations and the families behind them. It was a story about a woman who started with 63 cents and ended with something that couldn't be counted in a teacup. And it was a story about a little girl who walked into a mercantile one Saturday morning and bought a ribbon for herself and gave her last pennies to a child she didn't know, and walked past a woman who had once tried to make her feel small and didn't lower her head. Callum was standing at the fence post near the barn when Lenora came out of the house. He'd seen Elsie go down the lane too. They stood at the fence together for a moment, looking at the road where the girl had been. "She's going to be something," he said. "She already is something," Lenora said. He looked at her. She looked back, and the morning settled around them, ordinary, imperfect, and entirely theirs.